Hello everyone and welcome to another JavaScript Mastery video. This one is quite special because I have a unique and an extremely educational project to show you. We're going to build a complex expense tracker. While building it, you're going to learn many advanced React and JavaScript topics. Some of them are state management using React Context API, saving data into local storage, creating a user interface using Material UI, and you're even going to learn how to create a scalable React folder structure. But most importantly, you're going to learn how to add voice capabilities to your applications using Speechly. As you can see on this nice animation right here, Speechly allows you to level up your user interface with voice. It solves all of the problems that occur with old ways of entering data. Speechly is going to allow us to completely ditch the keyboard and use the voice to traverse the app, and in this video, I'm going to teach you how to use it. Allow me to give you a quick demo of the entire application. As you can notice, the main goal of the application is to track your income and expenses, so that you always know on which items you're spending most money on and which things bring you the most money. Let me show you how you can add a new transaction. Add income for $100 in category deposits for next Monday. As you just saw, this was amazing. In a matter of seconds, we filled the type, the category, the amount, and we've also chosen a date. Our income chart updated in real time and our transaction was added to the transaction history. Of course, you can still add all of these transactions manually. Let's add an expense. So let's go to expense, let's do something like category bills, and let's do $50. So in here, we can create a new transaction, and there we go, our expense chart was updated. As you noticed, this worked really well, but of course, it took some more time to actually input the data. Now, let's add one final expense using our voice. Add expense for $50 in category travel for next Thursday. Crazy how simple that is. I'm not even sure if you noticed, but I didn't have to be really detailed when I specified the date. I just said next Thursday and Speechly automatically set the date to 15th of December. Let me show you one final thing before we start building the project, and that is local storage. More specifically, you can completely close your tab, even your browser, and the next time you come back, all the data is still going to be here. I'm going to refresh the page to show you exactly what I mean. And there we go. That was it. You can see that all the data is still here. One thing that's also worth mentioning is how well this app works on mobile devices. As you can see, it looks like it has been made for mobile. Everything is nicely visible here, all the charts. The form comes at the top on mobile. With this said, our demo is done. Now it's your turn. Let's start building this amazing application. As always, we're going to start with an empty Visual Studio Code window. You can open it, and then inside of your desktop, you can create a new empty folder. We can name it something like expense_tracker. Okay, and then we're simply going to drag and drop that empty folder into our new Visual Studio Code window, which is then going to open it. Then you can maximize your window, and we're gonna work in here. Once you're in here, you can go under View and finally Terminal. This is going to open a built-in Visual Studio Code terminal. Of course, the first thing that we have to do is run npx create-react-app, and we can say /. This is going to initialize an empty React application right inside of our current directory. Our React app is initialized. What we can do right now is install all the necessary dependencies. But just this time, we're going to do something different as well. We're going to change the version of React and also React DOM, because some of the dependencies we'll be using still don't support React 17. So if you're updated to new React scripts and React 17, we'll just downgrade that to the latest version of 16 right now. Okay, so how can we do that? Well, the process is the same as when we install any other dependency. So that's going to be npm I for install, React, and then we say add 16.12.0. Same thing for React-DOM, add 16.12.0. And now we can continue installing all of our other dependencies. In this case, these are going to be add material dash UI forward slash core. Then we have add material dash UI forward slash icons. And one more thing from material UI, that's going to be add material dash UI forward slash lab. This is going to be for some new features that they have. Then we're going to install Speechly, which we're going to use for voice recognition. That's going to be add Speechly forward slash react dash client, add Speechly forward slash react dash UI. Then we need chart.js for our charts. We also need React components for those charts. So that's going to be react-chart.js-2. And what else do we need? Well, we'll need some unique IDs, and there's a package called uuid for creating unique identifiers. Great, I think that's going to be it. This is quite a lengthy line, so I'm going to copy all of this, and you'll be able to copy and paste it from the description down below. With that said, let's run it, install all the necessary dependencies, and we'll be able to start writing some code. Once everything is installed, we're first going to do a bit of a cleanup of the source folder, and then we're going to start our application. So feel free to completely delete the source folder and create a new one. So new folder, src. Inside of there, we of course need to have our index.js, and we of course need to have the app.js. Our index.js is a starting point of our application, and in there we say import React from React. Only in there we also need import React DOM from React-DOM. In here we're gonna import app from /app. This is going to be our main component. And finally we do React DOM dot render. This is the only time we're accessing the real DOM, and we're saying may our app go inside of our document dot get element by ID, and we need to target dot root. That is an empty div inside of our HTML. Once that is done, we can head to our app.js, and then in here we can create a component. I like to use the RAFCE, that is the React Arrow Function Export, so we immediately get a nice component. If you're wondering what that is, we can go to extensions and we can check the React snippets. There we go, ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native snippets. If you don't have this already, I would definitely recommend you to install it. With that, we can easily install components, but for now, I'm gonna do this first one by hand, just so you can see how it's done. So we're gonna say import React from React. Then we can say const app is equal to, and that's going to be a functional component. And just at the end, we have to do export default app. Inside of there, we can return any JSX. So in this case, we're gonna return a div that's simply going to say app for now. Now, if we save that, our index is connected, everything seems to be going well. Finally, we can run npm start. Okay, looks like it compiled successfully. So if you open your browser, just at the top corner, you'll be able to see that we have this little app right there. That means that everything is successfully connected. Let's check how our finished product looks like. As you can see, what we can do first is add this background image, and then we can focus on these three main components: the income tab, the expense tab, and also the whole expense tracker, plus this form right here. So let's start with the background. To add a background, we're going to add a new file that's going to be index.css right inside of our source. Inside of there, we're gonna say root, body, and HTML. So we're gonna apply some stylings to all of these three, and that is going to be height is equal to 100% and margin is equal to 0. Once we have that, we can finally apply the background to our body. So we can say body, and now how are we going to apply that background? Well, we first have to have that image. So we're gonna create a new folder, which is going to be called assets. And now inside of that folder, I'm going to drag and drop our image. I'm going to leave this in the description so you can download and use it as well. Inside of our body, what we have to do is say background, and we can say URL. Inside of that URL, you can simply say /assets/money.png. This is going to be our background. Okay, and also background size. So we want to take the background size property and set it to cover. Now we have to import this index CSS file right inside of our index.js. So just below, I'm simply going to say import and then /index.css. If we do that and go back to our application, you should be able to see that now we have this background image. Current problem is that the image is taking away from the content. It's too saturated. So what we have to do is darken it a bit. So we can go in here, back to our background body, and we're going to add a linear gradient. So we can say linear gradient, you call it as a function, and then in there you can say RGBA, and we're gonna use 0, 0, 0. That's the value for black. And then finally, we're gonna say 0.5. That's gonna be how much do we want to darken it. Okay, and then it accepts two different things. So the second thing is going to be the same, RGBA, 0, 0, 0, and then 0.5. Okay, if we add some spaces right here, finally we need to add a comma right here before the URL. Now, if we save that and go back, take a look. It's a bit darker, and now we can actually put some content in front of it. With that said, we can start creating these components, the card for the income and the expense, and our main component showcasing all the data. To create these components, I'm going to create a new folder, which is going to be called components. And then inside of there, we can create these. First, we're going to create the cards on left and right. These are going to be called details. So if we go back to our code, we can create a new folder called details with a capital D. And then inside of there, we can create a new file, which is going to be called details.jsx. Now we can use that RAFCE, which is going to create a functional component for us. And then inside of here, we'll import some things from Material UI. So we can say import, and what we need is going to be a card, card header, card content, and finally typography. We use typography for any kind of text in Material UI. This is going to be imported from @material UI/core. These are our details, and finally, let's create this structure. Instead of this div, in here, we're going to have a card. Inside of our card, we can create a card header, and that header is going to be a self-closing tag. Inside of there is going to accept one property, and that is going to be simply income or expense. For now, let's leave it static as income. Below that, we're going to have card content. So in here, card content, that is not going to be self-closing tag. Inside of that card content, we're going to have a typography. Typography is going to be of a variant H5. That means that it's simply going to behave like an H5 heading. And inside of there, we can have our total. So I'm going to put a $sign there, and let's say 50 for now. Below that, we want to display our chart. This is going to be a donut chart, and we simply want to import it from React chart.js 2. So we can do that like this: import donut from React-chart.js-2. So how do we use it? Well, you simply call it as a component, donut. It's going to be a self-closing tag, and we need to pass in some data. So inside of here, we need to pass some data. For now, I'm going to leave this blank because we have to figure out how this data is going to be passed. Now would be a good time to add some styling. So I'm going to show you how to do that. With Material UI, it's a bit different, but you're going to get used to it. What you need to do is create a new file inside of our details folder, and that file is going to be called styles, all lowercase, .js. Inside of here, we have to import something known as make styles. Make sure to have these curly braces right here from @material UI/core. Finally, we can export all the styles we want for that specific component. So we can say export default, make styles. We call that. That's a function, and it accepts one more function in return. So in here, and it also instantly returns an object. So we have to have the syntax looking like this. Only styles that we're going to write together are going to be these ones for the details JSX component. All the other styles from now, I'm going to give you right away, right below in the description. You'll be able to copy and paste them. But let me show you how this works. Let's say that we want to create some income class. You have to do it like this. Income is the object key, and then in here we have all of our styles. We can do something like border bottom, and then we can specify all the styles. Let's say that it's going to be 10 pixels, solid, RGBA, and we can do 0, 255, 0, and then 0.5. This is going to be a greenish color. Now we want to add a new class for expenses, so we can copy this and then simply make sure to add a comma and change the class name to expense. It's going to be really similar, but instead of having 255 at the green spot, we're going to have it in here as the red spot, and in here we're going to have the 0. Now that we have those classes, how do we actually use them inside of our details? Well, what you have to do is first import them. So we're going to say import use styles, they're a hook, from /styles. Okay, with that said, you know how hooks work. If you don't, I'm going to tell you right now. We have to call it just at the top of our function. So in here, we're going to say const classes is equal to use styles, and then we simply call it. So how do you use those classes? Well, right inside of here, you can say class name, and let's say that this class name is using classes.income. That is it. Okay, now our structure is done, and let's import this component inside of our app.js. So right inside of here, what you have to do is say import. That's going to be details from /components/details, and one more time /details. Finally, we can use those details right there, but let's create a bit of a structure. So inside of here, we're not only going to have those details, we need to create a structure that we have all of these. This taking the first third, this being in the middle, and this being at the last third. To do that, we're going to use something known as a grid from Material UI. So we can say import grid from @material UI /core. And now inside of this div, we can create a grid. This grid is going to be of a type container. So you can simply say container. It is going to have a spacing of 0. It's also going to have the align items of center. And it's going to have justify of center as well. Finally, we're going to add one inline style, and that is going to be height is equal to 100 VH. Okay, inside of that grid, we can now have grid items. So you can create another grid, and this time our grid is going to be of a type item. On extra small devices, it's going to take full space. So full width, that means 12. On small devices and larger, it's going to take 4. That means that 3 of them will be able to fit on the screen. And now inside of here, we're going to display those details components, right? Just like this. Now we can replicate this grid 2 more times. In here, this one is going to be our main component. So for now, I'm simply going to say main, but these two on left and right are going to remain details. So now if we save this, go back, and let's take a look. How does it look like? Okay, what we get is simply an error from our chart because we don't yet have any data. So we can go back to our details, and for now, simply comment out the chart because we're going to add the data later on. Would you look at that? We have our income, we have our main, and we have our income tab right here. First, I noticed that there's some slight issues with styling, so let's add that right now. Inside of our app.js, we're going to add some styles. So I'm going to create a styles file inside of the src, styles.js. Inside of there, as we mentioned, you're simply going to copy and paste all the styles that we get. With that said, we can get back to our app and let's add those class names. We already learned how you can import the styles. That is as simple as import use styles from /styles. And then finally, you have to say in here at the top of the component, const classes is equal to use styles. Don't forget to call it as a function. Now we have access to this classes object, and what we can do in our grid, we can simply say class name is equal to classes.grid. If we save that, let's see if that's going to make our app look any different. Okay, we definitely see some changes. The structure is definitely not perfect, but we're going to work on that once we actually implement the main component. Now, my question for you is, how would you make this being income and this being expenses? Considering that this all is the same component, how can we actually change the data inside of here and here? And the answer is simple. We can use props. Props is really the best way to do it here. What you can do in here is we're going to say something like title. First time, we're going to pass the title as income. And then the second time, once we call this component, we're going to pass in the title as expense. Okay, now if we go back to our details component, inside of here, we can destructure the props to take in the title. And based on that, we can now do different things. So inside of here, first thing is something like this, where title is not going to be an income, title is now going to be title. That means that it's going to change based on this prop right here. Also, in regards to this class name, we don't always want to have this as green, as income. So what you can do is use a ternary and say, if title is triple equal to income, then classes.income, else we're going to use classes.expense. With that said, if we go back, you can see that now we have this income right here and our expense right here with the red border bottom. Just so we can visualize this nicely, let's add the structure for the main component as well. That's also going to be a card. So right inside of our components, I'm going to create a new folder, which is going to be called main. Inside of our main, we're going to create a new file called main.jsx. And there we can also do a RAFCE. Okay, we can import some things from Material UI, and these things are going to be card header, card content, typography, grid, and then finally divider. All of this is going to be imported from @Material UI/core. Okay, once we have this, let's create the structure. The structure is going to be really similar. We're going to have a card. Our card is going to have a class name of classes.root. Below, we're going to have a card header. Card header, we already learned that is a self-closing tag. And then right inside of here, we can specify the title to be expense tracker. We can also add a subheader, and subheader is going to be equal to powered by Speechly. Later on, you're going to see how powerful Speechly is. In here, you can write anything you want. With that said, I just noticed that this classes is not defined. So let's create those classes. Inside of our main, I'm going to create a new file called styles.js. And then inside of there, magically, we're simply going to copy and paste all the styles. I'm going to give you access to them right inside of the description. Going back, we already learned the process. What we have to do is import use styles from and then /styles. And then we have to use them as a hook. So that's going to be const classes is equal to use styles, and we call it. I know it can be just a bit of a setup, but once you get used to it, Material UI styling is really powerful. Okay, with that said, we can continue. Below our header, we of course have our card content. Inside of our card content, we're going to have a typography. That typography is going to have the type of align is equal to center, and it's also going to be of a variant h5. What we're going to say there is going to be total balance, and then we can put a $sign, and then in here we can put some balance. Let's put $100 for now, just static. Later on, we're going to make this dynamic. Below this typography, we're going to have one more typography. This one is going to be of a variant subtitle 1. It's also going to have some inline styles, and those are going to be line height is equal to 1.5 em, and also margin top is equal to 20 pixels. Okay, and what is it gonna say? Well, inside of there, later on, we're gonna have a info card component. For now, we don't have that. What that simply means that in here, we're gonna say what you should say to get some information out of Speechly. So for now, we can say try saying, and we're gonna say add income for $100 in category. Let's do something like salary for Monday. So this is a demo sentence you can say to get something out of Speechly. Okay, then we're gonna have a divider right here. Divider is simply a horizontal rule or an HR that divides the content on the top from the content on the bottom. In here, we're gonna have our form. So I'm gonna leave this for the form component once we actually create it. And below that, we're gonna have one more card content. So after card content is finished, we're gonna create one new one. And there, this card content is going to have a class name of classes.card content. In there, we're going to have a grid. That grid is going to be of a type container, and it's also going to have a spacing of 2. Inside of there, we're going to have another grid. This grid is going to be of a type item, and it's simply going to take 12 spaces on extra small devices, so we can say xs is equal to 12. Inside of here, we're going to have our list component. List is also something we're going to implement later on, so for now, I'm going to leave it empty. For now, that's going to be it for our main component. Let's save it, and let's go back to our app.js so we can import it right there. Inside of here, with our details, we're also going to import our main. So we can override those details and say import main from components main. Finally, instead of simply saying main here, we can use it as a component. If we save that and go back, take a look at that. Now we have our income here, and we also have our main card. Now we have to figure out why is this not showing up in the right order. Okay, I found the issue. It was a really minor one. It was just that in here, in the main one, we have to have small 3 instead of 4. That way, we'll have enough space for all of these components to be visible right on our desktop. So now if we save that, you can see we have our income on the left side, we have our expense tracker in the middle, and then we have the expenses on the right side. To make our main component just a bit more complete, let's adding all the other components that go into it. That's going to be form and list primarily. So to create a form, we can create a new folder inside of our main, which is going to be called form. Inside of there, of course, you already know the drill. It's going to be form.jsx for our form component. There, we're going to do a RAFCE to create a functional component. And finally, we can start with creating our form. First, we're going to import something from Material UI, and these things are going to be as follows. First, we're going to have the text field that is just like an input. Then we cannot do anything with our typography. We're going to have a grid, a button, a form control, input label, select, and menu item. That's going to be it from add material UI/core. While we're here, we can also add the styles for the form. So styles.js. And then inside of there, magically just copy and paste the files. In this case, we don't have a lot there. Okay, going back to the form, import use styles from /styles. Inside of our component, as usual, const classes is equal to use styles, and then we call it. Okay, now we can start creating the structure for our form. Inside of here, we're going to have a grid. That grid is going to be of a type container, and it is going to have a spacing of 2. Inside of there, we're going to have one more grid. This one is going to be of a type item. And if you notice so far, we always have the same situation. One grid container, and then we have multiple grid items. This item is going to be XS12, meaning it's going to take a full size. And then inside of there, we can start creating some content. So we're going to say typography. That typography is going to have the align of center. And it's also going to have a variant of subtitle 2. It's also going to have a property gutter bottom, which is simply going to add some margin or padding at the bottom of the typography. Inside of here, we're going to put the words that we speak as we interact with Speechly. Right now, that's going to be left empty. So in here, I'm just going to add 3 dots. Below that, we're going to have one more grid. This grid is going to be also of a type item. So inside of here, we can say item XS. This time it's going to be 6. Inside of here, we're going to have a form control. That form control is going to be of a full width. And then inside of there, we can add all of our inputs. So first one is going to be simply input label. So that's going to be the label for the actual input. And that input label is going to say type. In here, we need to select, do we want our type to be income or expense? Now we can add a select field. So what does select do? Well, it's simply like a picker. It allows you to select multiple options. And how can we do that? Well, you simply put the options like this: menu item, and then inside of there, you need to put the value for each item. Our value is going to be income, and what the input is going to say, that's also going to be income. Finally, we can replicate that and add an expense. So inside of here, the second one is going to be expense. Make sure that this is just like this, value income with a capital I and E right there. For now, we're not going to add the logic. Now we're just creating the structure. Later on, we're going to add the logic of actually putting the value of this to the state. Continuing further down, next to this grid, we're going to have one more grid. This grid is also going to be of a type item, XS6, so the same thing. And then this one is going to be for our category. So same thing, we're going to have a form control. That form control is going to be of a full width. And then inside of there, we're going to have an input label. So we can say input label. Inside of here, we're going to say category. So you can see it's really similar. I have a typo there. And now inside of there, you guessed it, we are also going to have a select. Now in here, we're going to have a lot of categories. So it wouldn't make sense to simply write them all one by one in here. Later on, we're going to map through them right there. For now, let's add a few demo ones. So inside of here, I'm going to say menu item, and that menu item is going to have a value of something like business. And then inside of here, we're going to say business. And we can add a few more. This one is going to be something like salary, and we're going to say salary, just so we can see those categories. Okay, once that is done, we have two more grids and two more inputs. In here, the third one is going to be the same thing. Grid item XS6 means that it takes half the screen. Then inside of here, this is going to be just a normal text field in which we can enter some data. That text field is going to be of a type is equal to number, and it's going to have the label that's going to say amount. Text field is going to be a self-closing tag, so I can remove the closing one. This text field is also going to have a full width property, meaning it's going to take the full width of its container. Now I'm going to replicate this, and this one is simply going to be of a label date. So in here we can say date, and also type is going to be a date. So we can say that right there. When all of that is done, we need to have a button to submit our transaction. So we can add a button, which is going to have a class name of classes.button. It's going to have a variant of outlined, and it's going to have a color of primary. It's also going to have a property of full width, as our text fields do. That button is simply going to say create. Okay, now save that file and let's import it inside of our main. So right inside of here, if you're using Visual Studio Code, it could potentially just autofill this for you. You say form, and if you saw that, it automatically imported this form for us. If it didn't do that for you, simply make sure to say import form from /form/form. Okay, make sure to save the file and let's go back to our website. And would you look at that? In here, we have what we should say. We have the total balance. In here, later on, we're going to populate what we'll be saying at the time. And down below, we have our type. You can choose income or expense. In here, all of our categories are going to be dynamically populated. In here, you can type the amount. And finally, in here, you can select the date. And once all of that is done, you can create our transaction. That means that at least the layout of our form is completely done. Next thing that we could do is, if you take a look here, we have this nice little div that showcases all the previous transactions. It's scrollable, it stays here right below this button. So that's going to be our list. And if you take a look, if we add just a few transactions, you saw that nice little animation right there. We are also going to do that right now. Okay, so let's get back to our code and let's start adding it. That is going to be this list component right here. So just next to our form, still inside of the main, create a new folder called list. Inside of the list, we're going to create a list.jsx component and also styles.js. We can immediately copy and paste those styles as we always do. And let's create a React arrow function component. Inside of here, we'll have to import quite a few Material UI components, and these are going to be import list as Material UI list. This is a bit different. Why are we using as muy list here? Well, that's because our component is named list, so we have to rename the list coming from Material UI. Imports for all of our other components are going to be the same. So next we can do list item avatar, list item text. We can do avatar, list item secondary action, that's a long one, icon button. And do we need anything else? Yeah, we need a slide. Slide is the actual animation. So slide, and all of this is going to be imported from @material UI/core. Okay, in this case, we're also going to need some icons. So we can say import, delete, and money off. These are going to be imported from @material UI, but this time is not going to be core, it's going to be icons. Okay, we can also import our use styles from /styles. As always, to activate those styles, we have to do const classes is equal to use styles, and we call it. Now we are ready to start creating the layout for our list. Inside of here, everything is going to be wrapped in this Material UI list. It's going to have a property of dense, which is equal to false, and it's going to have a class name of classes.list. Now, inside of our list, we have to map over all of our transactions. So let's do just that. Let's create a mock transactions. So that's going to be transactions, which is going to be equal to simply to an empty array right now. So now we can use the JSX logic, and then inside of there, we can say transactions dot map. Inside of our map, we need to put a callback function. And of course, the thing that we get in there is going to be a transaction. We're not going to use curly braces here because that would be a function block. We're simply going to put parentheses because that means an instant return. So what are we going to return for each transaction? Well, first, we're going to turn a slide. Slide is our animation, so everything that's inside of this slide component is going to be animated. We can say direction down. Well, why do we do down? Because once you actually create this, we're giving a visual feeling that this transaction from the form is sliding right down into our list right here. Just a nice visual touch. Then it's gonna animate in. It's also going to have mount on enter and unmount on exit. So we can do it like that. And it needs to have its own key because we're mapping over it. So in here, we can put the key as transaction.id. That means that we now know that each one of our transaction needs to have an ID. So we can create a demo transaction, which is going to have an ID of 1. As we go, we're going to see how our transactions need to look like and what they need to have. And I know we're creating a lot of JSX now using a lot of Material UI, and we haven't really dived into the logic of how this actually works. But don't worry, once we actually have all the JSX here, all the structure laid down for us, it's going to be so much easier to work with Context API, to traverse the data, and finally to implement Speechly to this great application. Inside of our slide, we're going to have a list item component. That list item component is going to have a list item avatar inside of it. List item avatar is going to have yet another component, and that is going to be an avatar. And that avatar is going to have quite a few things. It's going to have a class name. Class name is going to depend on if the thing is an income or an expense. So we can say transaction dot type. If transaction dot type is equal to income, then we want to have our class name be equal to classes dot avatar income. Else it's going to be equal to classes dot avatar expense. Okay, that's great. And now we also know that our transaction needs to have a type. So let's add a type right here. And the type can either be an income or an expense. In this case, let's add an income. Inside of our avatar, we're simply going to have a money off icon. So money off. And as you can see, money off icon is also being called as a self-closing component, which is really handy. Just below our list item avatar, we're going to add a list item text. This list item text is going to be a self-closing component, and it's going to have a primary property. Primary is going to be equal to transaction dot category. So this means like on which category is this transaction made on. So we now know that our transaction needs to have a category property, and category can be anything from like, let's say business or salary, or if it's an expense, it can be something like home, pets, or any other expense category. Okay, now that we have that, it's also going to have a secondary. And secondary property is going to be the actual cost. So in here, secondary, we're going to put this as a template string. Why as a template string? Because we're going to show two things in there. First one is going to be the amount, and the second one is going to be the date. So for the amount, I'm going to put the $sign, but then we need to put the $sign curly braces to enable dynamic syntax. Then inside of here, we're going to have a transaction dot amount, and also once we leave that dynamic block, I'm going to simply put a dash in there with a space and open another dynamic block of our string. In there, we're going to have a transaction dot date. Okay, this is going to be our list item text, and that simply let us know that we need to have both the amount and the date in our transaction. So inside of here, I'm going to add the amount. That can be, for example, $50 right now. And we're also going to add a date, and this is going to be a new date. And this is going to be a date object most likely, so I'm simply going to do new date like so. Below our list item text, we're going to have one more thing, and that is going to be the button to delete that thing. So we can say list item secondary action. Inside of there, we're going to have an icon button. That icon button is going to have an edge. Edge is going to be set to a string of end. Then we're going to have an area label, which is going to be set to delete. And later on, we're going to have an onClick property right here. For now, I'm going to leave that as an empty string. That icon button is simply going to have a delete icon. And that is going to be it for our list component. If we now save that, we can go back to the main and simply import our list by saying list. And looks like it's this one here. So it's going to be imported from ./list/list. It's also going to be a self-closing component. Now, if we save that and go back to the browser, let's refresh and take a look. Since we added a lot of changes, it's still going to be compiling. You can see it's going to take some time, but once it compiles, we should see the changes in the browser. Okay, it's compiled now, and you can see that we have our list item right here. It's not perfect because we have this whole date object right here. I forgot that later on we're going to actually strip that and include only the most important things. So what we can do right now is simply go back to the list and leave this date as a meaningful, just a string. So I'm going to copy just the first part of this date object, which is going to be Wednesday, December 16th. And we're going to go back and simply paste that in here as a string. Great. And while we're here, let's add a few more transactions. So this one is going to have an ID of 2. This one can be 3. Let's do this one as an expense, and it's going to have a category of pets. Amount can be, let's do 50, but the last one can be 150. It's going to be something like business here, and let's change the date for each one, and let's see how does it look like. Don't forget to add the commas right here. Save that, and let's go back. And would you look at that? We have a rolling list right here. It's not going to occupy the space if you add more of the things because it has a fixed height. So at all times, only 2 transactions are going to be visible, but you can scroll through all of them. So what do we have in each list item? Well, first of all, we have this icon here indicating if it's an income or an expense. This one is green, so that's going to be an income. We have the category of our spending or the income, the amount right there, and we have the date when the transaction was made. If you want to delete the transaction, you can also click this button right here, and that's going to delete only this specific transaction. Currently, this is all simply representational, but I think now is a great time to actually start moving to the context or the logic side of things. What do you say? On one of the previous projects I've done, I've used Redux, but you guys mentioned this time, let's use context. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Inside of the src, we're going to create one new folder, and that folder is going to be called context. Inside of here, you can create a new file, which is going to be called context.js. This is going to be the file in which we're going to implement all the logic for the React's context API. First thing that we're going to do is import React, as well as use reducer and create context. And all of that is going to be imported from React. Make sure that this is a default import and all of these are named imports because they are inside of curly braces. Just below, we're going to create our context. So we can say const expense tracker context is equal to create context. And now in here, we have to pass in the initial state. At the start, we're going to set our initial state to be equal to simply an empty array, no transactions at the start. Then, of course, we also have to export our expense tracker context. And below, we can export a new functional component called provider. So we can say export const provider. And that is going to be equal to, as I mentioned, a functional component. Inside of there, in the props, we're going to get children. And now, what are we rendering here? What's happening? Well, we'll be rendering the full logic for context. So everything that's wrapped with this component is going to have access to the context. So what we can do is we can return some JSX. And that JSX is going to be expense tracker context dot provider. So this is going to be our component. And the only thing that this thing renders in between is going to be children. That means that everything that is wrapped inside of this provider will be visible right here, and it's going to be wrapped with this expense tracker provider. So where do we actually store those context values? Well, right in here. You can say value is equal to, and now you can pass anything. Let's put that as an object, for example, and for now, let's say app name, and that's going to be expense tracker. So now this is only static, but in here we'll have all the data about transactions, about balance, and actions for deleting and adding transactions. For now, this is just static. What I want to achieve is get access to this app name inside of all of our components. Inside of every single component that we have, we need to be able to access this context. That's the main thing. Let me give you a bit of an introduction to context. Before context, we had to use something known as Redux. I mean, some people still use it, but some people dislike it because it has a lot of boilerplate code, meaning we have to write a lot of things to make it work. In that regard, context is a lot simpler. So what Redux had is one global store. So one state of truth that all components can grab some info from or some data from. Context is really similar. We're going to wrap our application with a provider, and all of our components will have access to this value property, whatever is inside of it. With that said, this is going to be it. Now we are exporting these things, and finally we can go inside of our index.js to finally wrap our whole application with our context. Inside of here, we'll have to import just one thing, and that is going to be import provider from /context/context. Okay, once we have that, we can finally wrap our app. So I'm just going to spread this into multiple lines, just like so. And in here, I'm going to write provider, wrapping this thing, and I'm going to paste the closing tag just after the app and make sure to move the comma. Okay, let's indent this properly. And that is going to be it. We just wrapped our application with this provider. So one step is done. That is wrapped. We store this information right here. Now the question is, how can we retrieve that inside of all of our components, inside of any of our components? Well, let's try to go to, for example, app in here. Or let's try to go into a really nested component, something like a list. So how do we get access to that app name inside of here? Well, the only thing you have to do is import a few things. One is going to be use context from React. So inside of here, I'm going to write use context. And we also have to import the expense tracker context. So just below, I'm going to say import expense tracker context. And that's going to be coming from // one more time, context and context. And you just call it as a hook. It is as simple as that. So the only thing you have to do is go right here and say const. This is going to be something. We're still not sure what we're getting, but let's say global state. Let's just call it like that. We're getting that from, and then we call use context. And the only thing you have to do is pass in which context do you want to get. Finally, let's console log this global state. What is that? So if you console log that global state, keep in mind that in here we're just declaring a variable. So really you can name this anything you want. And now if we go back and if we open our console, refresh, okay, we have some warnings because remember before we simply set the onClick to be an empty string until we actually add the logic. That's okay. But if you look at the top, I'm going to even make this a bit bigger for you. We have an object and that object has the access to the app name, which is equal to expense tracker. That means that we are actually accessing this context from a deeply nested component. And if you want to use this in some other components like details, the only thing you have to do is copy these two lines, this one and this one. This is just something I wanted to show you to explain how it's working. But for now, I'm going to get rid of this. And we're going to go back to our context and actually implement real logic in here instead of this static string. So what logic are we dealing with here? Well, logic for adding and deleting transactions. Just at the top of this component, we'll use something known as use reducer. So just type use, start typing, and click this use reducer right here. So what is use reducer? As you can see, it is a hook because it starts with use. And it is a hook that is not so often used because it's just a more complex version of the use state, which is more popular. But you can see it is just a built-in React hook because we are importing it right from React. So how do we use it and what does it do? Well, if you hover over it, it's going to simply say an alternative to use state. It says use reducer is usually preferable to use state when you have a complex state logic that involves multiple sub-values. Okay, we're going to stop there. Basically, it is a use state, but when you have more complex state. So you can see it has the similar structure. It starts with state here, but instead of set state, we have dispatch. And then in here, it accepts a few parameters. The first one is the reducer, and the second one is the initial state. Third one is optional, and we won't be needing it in this case. You can see this reducer is not defined. What is the reducer? Well, reducer is just a single function that specifies how will we be changing our state. That is it. So at the top of our file, we can import our reducer. I'm going to call it context reducer. And we're importing that from /context reducer. You can see it wasn't autofilling this for me, and that's because it doesn't exist yet. We're going to create it right now. So inside of our context, you can create a context reducer. So once again, what is a reducer? Reducer is simply a function. So we're going to say reducer, a function that takes in the old state and an action and returns a new state. Okay, so it takes in two parameters. It takes in the old state and an action. Action specifies how do we want to change the state. So if we have the old state and if we have the specification for the change, then we can return the new state, and that's going to be it. So let's do something like this. Const context reducer, and that's going to be equal to an arrow function as we mentioned. We're gonna export it here, export default context reducer. And we already know it has to accept two parameters. The first one is going to be the state, and the second one is going to be the action. So what is the action? Well, the action is going to be, for example, add transaction, and the other one is going to be delete transaction. And based on these, we have to return some different state. For now, we're simply going to leave this empty and go back to the context.js. Inside of here, we can put this context reducer right here instead of this reducer. And with that, our use reducer function is almost done. Now we have to actually make use of the state and the dispatch. Our state in this case is actually going to be just transactions. So I can rename that. Our state represents all of the transactions. To keep the logic simple, just below here, I'm going to create our actions. Or more specifically, in Redux terms, these would be action creators. So what are those? Well, you're going to see. It's just plain JavaScript, don't worry. Const delete transaction. So this is going to be a function, an arrow function, that's gonna happen once we delete the transaction. To delete a transaction, what do we need? Well, we need to know which one are we deleting, and we'll know that based on the ID. So this is going to accept one ID parameter. And once we have that, we can simply dispatch. So now we're actually dispatching something. And what are we dispatching? Well, we'll be dispatching an action. Action is just a plain object that has two different things. First thing is a type. In this case, our type can be something like delete transaction. Okay? And what is going to be our payload? Our payload is the second thing. That is simply some additional data we want to pass over with our action. In this case, we can leave the payload to be the ID. So what are we saying here? We are saying once you delete the transaction, then call this function with the provided ID and dispatch an action saying, yes, delete this, this is the ID. Now, just to reiterate, we're going to create one more, which is going to be called add transaction. What do we need when we are creating the transaction? Well, we cannot have the ID because it doesn't exist yet. We need the entire transaction. And how is this going to look? Well, really similar. We're going to dispatch, again, just an action, which is simply an object. It's going to have a type, and type is going to be add underscore transaction. And it's also going to have a payload. And the payload is simply going to be the entire transaction. This is it. We can even put these in one line since they have just one instant return. So if I put this in one line, I can also put this in one line, and that's going to be it. As you can see, these are the functions that are dispatching something. That means that they are changing the state of transactions. The question is, when are we going to call these functions? We're not going to simply call them here, like delete transaction and then pass the ID of 2. No, that's not going to happen. We have to pass these functions over to our entire application context. And how can we do that? Well, now that you know that, it's going to be simple. Inside of our provider value, you can simply expand it. And in here, we're going to pass the delete transaction as well as the add transaction. These are just values in an object. If you know your ES6+, then you know that if property has the same key and the value, you can simply write a shorthand, and that is just this. This now means that we're sending over the delete transaction and the add transaction to our entire state. And now we have a complete control over where we want to call these functions. For example, one good way would be to call it right in here. Take a look, delete. Once we click this, we want to simply call that. That is it. So now I just see that I deleted that last state, but if I just bring everything back for just a second, we have the use context, we have this use context right there and global state. Let's save it one more time and see what do we get back. And take a look at that. Now we don't have the app name. Now we have two different functions right here, which we can use. What people often do is they simply destructure the values. So in here, we can simply destructure. What do we need from that? And that is going to be delete transaction. What people often do is they don't want to use the whole state, so we can simply destructure what we want to use. And we want to use only delete transaction. So later on, once we implement the logic for delete right here, this is where we're going to put it. Okay, now we have a major part of the context done. You can see we have the logic for deleting and adding, but the next big thing is actually focusing on what's going to happen once we click that button. What is going to be the logic for adding transactions and what is going to be the logic for deleting them? Now that we know how our action is going to look like, and we know that based on this, it's going to have a type and a payload, we can form our reducer. We're going to have two different actions. One is going to be for adding transactions. So in here, we can say if action.type is equal to, and then in here, that's going to be delete transaction. And we can have one for adding transactions. So just below, we can say else if action.type is equal to add transaction. Okay, so that's how you can do it. What people often do with reducers is they use switch statements. And I know switch statements are not used a lot in general programming, but this is a really good use case for switch. In here, you simply say, based on the action type, if the action type is, for example, delete transaction, then do this thing here. If the action type is something different, so if case is equal to add transaction, then simply do what is said right here below. And then finally, we can have a default case. So in this case, we're going to use all the best practices and we're going to remove our if and else, and we're going to use a switch. So what do we want to do if we want to delete a transaction? Let's think about it. Let's say that we have an imaginary array here, const transactions, and it's going to have one object in there. So it's going to be a transaction that's going to have an ID of 1, and we don't really care about all the other things that it has. And that transaction, or rather the transactions array, is actually the state. Remember, we said our entire state is going to be transactions. So how do we actually remove this transaction with only the ID specified? Well, what you can do is you can say const transactions is equal to, and then you can simply say state.filter. So we're filtering our state. And filter works in a way that it accepts a callback function. So it accepts a callback function, and then it loops through each one of the transactions. In this case, let's call it T for short. If t.id is not equal to action.payload, remember, that's our ID here for delete. If that's not equal to, then it's simply going to remove it from the array. It's going to keep all the other transactions. For example, if we have something like ID is equal to 2, 3, and so on, it's going to keep all the other ones except the one that we are specifying in the action.payload when we're calling the function. And that's going to be stored in this variable here, all the transactions, not including the one that we deleted. Okay, now that we know that, what do we have to do from the reducer? Well, reducer simply has to return the transactions. That is it. Delete it, return it. That's it. We can remove this break because return instantly removes it. You can even see it says there unreachable code. And now we have to think about the logic for adding the transactions. How can we do that? This is going to be quite simple as well. We can say const transactions, and that's going to be equal to an array. Inside of there, we're going to put our new transaction. And if you remember correctly, once we call the add transaction, then inside of the payload, we provide the entire data for the transaction. So what we are saying is this. We have a new array, add the action.payload, and then spread all the other transactions. So spread the state. This is going to make sure that our new transaction pops up at the start, and then all the current transactions are still stored there. Again, the only thing we have to do is say return transactions. And even though we're in a different case, in here and in here, we still cannot have two variables with the same name. So what we can do is declare a new variable, a transactions variable right here. And then we can simply reassign it. So in here, we're going to reassign it to this, return it. And then in here, we're going to reassign it to this and then return it. That solves our error. If no case is matched, then what we can simply do is return the current transactions. And that is simply going to be the state. And that's it. This is our context reducer. Later on in here, we're going to add the logic for the local storage so we can actually store all of the items in the browser's memory. But for now, this is more than enough. Now would be a good time to use this reducer, or more specifically, to use this action creator to dispatch an action that's going to add a transaction. I know it might sound a bit confusing, but now once you see it in action, it's all going to make sense. So where are we going to add our transaction? Well, if you think about it, that's going to be inside the form. So where are we going to add our transaction? Well, if you think about it, that's going to be inside of the form, right here. Before we do that though, we have to focus on putting all of our inputs into our state. So then we can create a transaction. To do that, just at the top, I'm going to create a new variable, and that is going to be called initial state. Initial state is going to be set to an empty object, and it's going to have a few things. It's going to have an amount, which is going to be set to an empty string. It's going to have a category, which is again going to be set to an empty string. It's going to have a type. Type at the start we can set to, for example, income. And it's also going to have a date. date is going to be equal to, let's do new date for now, but as we said later on, we're going to actually format this. Now, based on this, we can import the use state from React, the use state hook, more precisely, and we can use it. So just below here, I'm going to say use state, and we're going to call our state something like form data. So we have form data and set form data, and that is going to be equal to initial state. So initially, all of this data is set just like this. So how can we make these inputs actually affect the state? Well, let's do one by one. First one is going to be this select field right here for the income or expense. It's going to have a value, and the value is going to be of form data.type. If you can see that above, it can either be income or expense. So that is the current value, and then we also have to add the onChange to be able to change it. So onChange, once the user actually selects this, in there we get the event and a callback function. Once this is changed, we're gonna say set form data, call it as a function, and then in there we have to put an object. Because we're changing the entire state, we have to first spread the entire form data. So that's gonna be ... form data. And only after we've spread everything, then we only change the type. So we can say type is equal to e.target.value. That's going to populate our type with either the value of income or expense. Okay, that's going to be it for this one. Now we can do generally almost the same thing for this select down below. We can say value of that select is going to be equal to form data.category. And for the onChange one more time, first we have a callback function which accepts the event, and then in there we want to set form data, call it, set it to an object, first spread the entire form data, and then simply set the category to be equal to e.target.value. This is going to change only the value of our category to one of these categories. Right now we still have two. Later on, we're going to map over this to have all of the different categories, which are going to be changing if we're on income or if we're on expense. Moving further, we have only two inputs left to handle. The first is going to be the amount. So what we can do is we can say value is equal to form data.amount. And then we need to add the onChange. OnChange is going to be equal to, again, a really similar thing. We get the event. We put that as a callback function, which sets the form data. So set form data. We pass in an object there, spread the entire form data, and then specify only the thing that we want to change, and that is the amount, which is going to be equal to e.target.value. Okay, I'm gonna copy that entire thing so we don't have to write it one more time. So with the value and the onChange, and paste it for our date field. Inside of here, the only thing that has to change is this. This is gonna be changed to date. And then set form data, what we're changing is gonna be the date. Again, this is going to be eTarget value for now, but later on, we're going to format that. Okay, with that said, we are now actually storing all of that into our state. What could be good is if we actually just console log the state. So let's console log form data and see if that is actually being changed. Okay, now we can refresh. And let's start changing the inputs. I'm gonna change this to expense. Let's take a look. Amount nothing, category nothing, date is here, and this changed to expense. Now I'm gonna select the category. Let's go with salary. Salary is here. I'm gonna change the amount to 50, for example. There we go. The amount is also here. And finally, we can select the date. Let's go for 17th. And if you check that out, that is it. We have full thing over here. Everything works. Now we have to hook our action to this create button. Once we click that, we should be calling the add transaction that we implemented the logic for. We can do that if we go back right here, and then just at the bottom in here, we have to add the on click. How can we do that? Well, we already discussed that, but let's go over it one more time. Inside of here, what we have to import is going to be the expense tracker context, and that's going to be coming from ... one more time, context, and that's going to be context one more time. So this is where we're getting the expense tracker context from. We also have to import the use context to be able to fetch it. Now, inside of our component, what we can do is we can say const the structure.add transaction, and we can say equal to use context. And which context are we using? Well, the expense tracker context. Now we have access to this function that is going to add the transaction. So what are we going to do with that? We're going to create one more function, which is going to be called const create transaction. And that's going to be equal to an arrow function. And this function is going to be responsible for creating that actual transaction. The question is, when is it going to get called? And the answer is, it will get called once we click, of course, the create button. So right here at the bottom, we're going to add an on-click listener, and we're going to simply say create transaction. That means that once we click this button, we're going to call this function right here. For now, the only thing we have to do in that function is simply say add transaction. So we're calling that thing from above. And what do we need to do? Well, we have to pass the entire transaction, but we have to modify it first. This form data is not going to be the only thing that we need. You can notice that we don't have the ID here, and we absolutely need to have it. So let's create it. I'm going to create a new variable called transaction, and that's going to be equal to an object. Of course, that object is going to spread all of the properties from the form data. We need the income, the category, the type, but now we're going to modify a few things. First thing is going to be the amount. We don't want to have the amount in a string. What I'm going to do is simply cast it to a number. So we can say number, and then inside of there, form data.amount. Now, this is not a string, it's going to be a number. And the second thing is that we need to add the ID. And the ID is going to be equal to, of course, we cannot simply say it's static, 1. For that, we're going to use the library called uuid. uuid creates a new unique ID every single time. And we can simply import it. That's going to be import v4 as uuid v4 from uuid. That's it. And basically, the only thing you have to do is call that uuid function where you say id is equal to uuid version 4, and then you call it as a function. That is it. Now we have our complete transaction. To remember correctly, you might know what the add transaction takes in as parameter. We're going to go back into the context and take a look. Add transaction is a function that takes in one transaction. And that is really simple. What we're going to do is simply pass in that transaction. After we've added the transaction, of course, we can set the form data to be equal to the initial state. That means that we're simply resetting all of these state fields so that then user can add a new transaction. Okay, this is really good. So now we went through a full circle of actually creating the reducers, creating the dispatch functions, passing them into the context, accepting them into our component, and then actually calling them. Once the add transaction is called, that's going to fire up and go straight to here. And then in here, we're going to add it, and it's going to be added to the transactions. So where is that going to be reflected? It should be reflected right here. We're finally coming to the last part of this use reducer, and that's the transactions. So just below, I'm going to console log transactions. And let's see if it's really going to be added. Going back to our application, I'm going to refresh, clear the console, and let's try adding something. It's going to stay as income. I'm going to add it as a business, $50, and let's select a date, 17th. And here's the moment of truth. Once I click on this, there we go. As you can see here, we console logged the transactions from the context, line 16, and we got back an array, and that array contains one object, which is our entire transaction. It has the amount of 50, category of business, it has a specific date, ID, and finally it has the type. You can see this ID is a really long, just a string with a lot of numbers and characters, and that is going to be unique for each one. That is great. We now have the transaction. What would make sense to do right now is to replace these static transactions with the one we just added. Let's do that right now. So let's find the ones that we had that are static, and I think that's in the list right here. Yep, here are the transactions. So how do we bring the transactions from the context, these ones right here, to our list component? And we can do that easily. Let me show you how. We have the transactions here, we just console log them, and what we can do is simply put them inside of here. So along with the functions delete transaction and add transaction, which are modifying the transactions, we have the transactions themselves. So now that we know that, we can head back to the list. Inside of here, with the delete transaction, we can also take in all of the transactions. Okay, that is it. We can delete those now. And if we now save it, go back to our website right here, refresh. Transactions are gone. Let's try to add a new one. Salary, $100, and let's select a random date. There we go. Salary popped up right here. Everything seems to be working. Of course, we still have some warnings because we haven't completed the function for the delete. As you can see, it doesn't work, but that could be a reasonable next step. You can see we have this delete transaction right here, and right there, we're never using it. So what you can do is create a callback function. And once somebody calls this, we simply want to call delete transaction. So delete transaction. And then remember, delete transaction takes in one parameter, and that parameter is the ID. So where is the ID stored? Well, considering that we are mapping over these transactions, each transaction has its own ID, so it's going to be stored under transaction.id. That is it. Now, if we save that, go back, refresh the page, of course. Let's add a new one. Okay, there we go. Create. And let's click delete and see if it works. Beautiful. We just implemented the logic for our transactions. Small improvements we could do right now is to add all of the categories in here and make them change depending if we are an income or expense. And also we can format our date because you can see at the start, it is set to nothing. Since there is going to be quite a lot of categories, both for incomes and expenses, we're not going to write them right here in this file, nor in the form. We're going to create a new file. So go ahead and close all of your files and collapse all the folders, and let's go into the SRC. Inside of here, we're going to create one new folder, and that folder is going to be called constants. Okay, so we have our constants, and then right inside of our constants, we're going to have our categories. So you can create categories.js. This is going to be quite a long file with a lot of different income categories and expense categories, along with all the different colors for each single category. I spent quite a lot of time for looking for some awesome greenish colors and reddish colors for expenses, but here you go. For you, it's going to appear magically in just 1 second. This is it. These are all the categories. The link is going to be down in the description, so just make sure to find the file and copy and paste it here. I don't want you to spend an hour and a half for finding all of these colors and then finally creating the array of all of these different categories. You have it here, and that is it. So just to go over it briefly, we have the income categories, for example, business, investments, extra income, deposits, lottery. And we also have expense categories like bills, car, clothes, travel, and so on. At the start, the spending for each category, or actually the income, is set to 0. Finally, all of the categories have their own colors, and these colors are going to be represented on the chart. Down below, we have one reset categories function, which simply resets all the categories if we want to clean them. Okay, that is it. Now that we have that, we can go back inside of our form. That's going to be inside of our components, main, form. And then now we need to import all of these categories. Okay, so how are we going to import them? Well, we can say import income categories and also expense categories. That's going to be imported from constants and then categories. Okay, now we have all of our categories. And now, instead of these static ones, we're gonna actually loop through all the categories for incomes if we are on the income type, and if we're on the expense type, we're only gonna loop through the expense categories. So how can we do that? Well, first, at the top here, we're gonna create a new variable, which is going to be called selected categories. So selected categories. And that's going to be equal to something. Well, it can be equal to income categories, right? But it can also be equal to expense categories. The only thing this depends on is the type of the form data. If the form data type is equal to income, then we show income categories. Otherwise, we show expense categories. So what we can say is form data dot type is triple equal to income. If that's the case, then we render this using a ternary operator. Else, we're gonna show the expense categories. Now we have this variable which only stores the categories that we need. Finally, down here, we can now loop over the selected categories. Okay, and how are we going to do that? Well, remove these, and finally, open JSX dynamic block and say selected categories dot map. We're mapping over all of them. We're gonna use a callback function inside of the map. We're gonna write C short for category. And what do we want to render for each category? Well, as before, we want to render the menu item. That menu item is going to have a key of c.type, so that's category.type, and it's also going to have a value of c.type. Finally, what is it going to say? Well, you guessed it, it's gonna say c.type. That's the actual category, the type of the category. And with this one line, we'll actually be rendering all of the categories dynamically. Let's save that and go back to the browser. If we go back right here, take a look. Categories, we have business, investments, savings, rental income, salary. And if we switch this to expenses or expense, we have bills, car, clothes, travel, and everything else. So this is pretty good. The last thing we need to do to modify this is to format the date. To modify the date, of course, we could use a library like moment.js, but in this case, I decided it is simple enough so that we can do it ourselves. We're going to create a utility function that's going to format our date into a Material UI suitable format. So to do that, we can again collapse all of our folders, and then inside of the src, you're going to create a new folder called utils. That stands for utility functions. Inside of utils, you're going to create one new function, and that's going to be called format date.js. Inside of here, we simply have to create that function. So we can say const format date is equal to, that's going to be an arrow function. Of course, we can export it right now just so we don't forget. So export default format date. Okay, our format date function is going to accept, of course, a date object. So what do we want to do with that? First of all, let's make sure that it is actually a date object. So what we can do is say const, let's do something like the is equal to new date, and then we're gonna call it date like so. Then we need to get the month. So how do we get the month? Well, it's gonna be const month is equal to, and that is going to be in a string format. So I'm gonna put a template literal here. We put $ curly braces, d.get month, and you call it as a function. Of course, we have to increment 1 because months start from 0. Then we can get the day. So we can say const day is equal to, again, a template literal, curly braces, and then d.getDate, just like so. Finally, we can get the year. Const year is equal to d.getFullYear, and you call it. Okay, now that we have that, we have to focus on months and days that don't have 2 digits. For example, if we are in December, that's gonna be 12, right? That's okay, it's gonna have 2 digits. But if we are, for example, in January, that's gonna be 1. But the right format is not 1, it is actually 0, 1. So we have to add that 0, we have to prepend it. And this is how we do it. If month.length is lower than 2, then what we can do is we can set the month to be equal to, and that's going to be 0, and then we simply have to add the current month. Of course, for this to work, we have to change this from const to length. Then you can simply copy this one more time, and what we can do is we can say this for the day. So we can say day, 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 and the situation is completely the same. Okay, with that said, we can finally return our date. And this is how it's going to look like. Return an array where we have the year, month, and the day. Finally, we run the dot join on that, and we want to join them with a dash in between. This is it. This is the function that formats the date in a Material UI suitable format. With that said, we can go back to the form, and then in there, we can import that format function. So at the top, we can say import format date from ... one more time, and that's going to be utils / format date. Okay, and where do we want to call it? Well, we want to format it initially right here, so just before we actually add it to the state. And also we want to format it in one more place, and that's going to be once we actually set the date. That's right here at the bottom. On change, date is going to be equal to target value, but we're gonna format that what we receive in a suitable way. Okay, if we now save that, let's go back to the browser and see if it works. Okay, refresh and take a look. Our date is immediately populated and we can keep changing it. It appears nicely right here. Next thing that we could do would be to add the charts right here. Now that we can successfully create transactions, well, only through the inputs right now. Of course, the biggest point of this whole video is to add Speechly, but we're gonna do that soon enough. Now, as we can add the transactions, it would be great if they appeared right here on the chart as well. So to add the chart, we can go back to our code, and chart is gonna be showing right inside of the details, remember? In here, we have that chart, but that chart has to have the data. And if you think about it, calculating this data is not gonna be easy. What we have to do is take all the transactions that we have into consideration, take all the categories that we have into consideration, and then sum up only the specific transactions from specific categories and then display them all. Of course, we have to calculate the total as well. Technically, we could do all of that right here inside of this component, but that would add a lot of complicated logic and clutter this component. Usually, when you can, you should go just for simple components that are simply representational, meaning they simply return some JSX. So, what are we going to do in this case? It's going to be something just a bit advanced, and that is going to be creating a custom hook. So how can we create a custom hook? Well, first, let's collapse everything and let's open only the SRC. Inside of this SRC, we're going to create a new file, and that new file is going to be called use transactions. Why use? Because all hooks start with use. Now, inside of this file, we're going to deal with all the logic for calculating the categories, the transactions, and the totals, and then in the details, we'll be able to simply fetch that data right here in one line. So let's focus on the use transactions logic. First of all, in here, we're going to import use context from React. We are also going to import expense tracker context from /context/context. And we're also going to import the income categories, the expense categories, and the reset categories function. That's going to be imported from /constants/categories. Now that we have all of that, we have to create our use transactions custom hook. And what is a custom hook? It is basically an arrow function that starts with use. That is the only rule to make it a custom hook. It has to start with use, and it has to use some of the React features, such as use context or something similar to that. Inside of here, our use transactions hook is going to accept one parameter, and that is going to be the title. Based on the title, we'll know if we are in the income categories or expense categories. As soon as our use transactions hook runs, we're going to call the reset categories, because we have to reset the amounts of each specific category to 0. Once we have that, we of course can get the transactions, and that's going to be const transactions, we destructure them, from, or rather equal to, use context, and we pass in the context, which is the expense tracker context. Now that we have the transactions, we want to filter out only the ones for a specific type. Is it going to be income or is it going to be expense? So how do we do that? Well, we can say selected categories, and that is going to be really similar to what we had in here in the form. Remember? We had selected categories. If form data that type is income, then we only have income categories and so on. In this case, it's going to be just a bit different because in here we have all the transactions. So what we have to do is we have to call the transactions dot filter. Filter, of course, accepts a callback function. In here, we can say t for transaction, and we're going to keep only the ones where t.type is equal to title. So only if t.type is equal to title, we're going to keep those. And then we'll end up only with categories for income or with categories for expenses. Now that we have all the categories, what we can do is we can say const total is equal to selected transactions. So just like this, selected transactions dot reduce. Reduce is one of these functions that's kind of obscure and not a lot of people actually try to use it. That's because everything that you can do with reduce, you can do with .map or .foreach or filter, but sometimes it's better to use reduce. It is better to use reduce when you have an array of multiple things, like for example, numbers or amounts or anything, and then you want to sum those numbers up into one single piece of value. In this case, that's going to be 2 plus 2 plus 2, that's 6 plus 3 is going to be 9. So this is going to be 9. In this case, it would be best to use reduce. Of course, you could do this with for each, where you're going to create a total variable, and then for each iteration, you would add 2 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2 to the total, and then you would get the sum. But that would require you to create an extra total variable. In this case, reduce is better. So how does it work? Well, reduce again accepts a callback function. Inside of there, we have two parameters. First one is an accumulator, and then we have a current value. We can abbreviate it for curval. Once we have that, the only thing we have to do is we have to say accumulator plus equal to current value dot amount. That's where the amount is stored. And that is it. Finally, after this callback function, the second parameter to the reduce is the initial value. And initially, it's going to be set to 0. That is it for our total. These selected categories are actually all the transactions for that category. We could rename that afterwards, but now we're going to have const categories. And now I'm noticing that we kind of have a lot of naming like inconveniences right here. Selected categories, income categories, expense categories, then we have categories. What are those? I think we should rename this. These are not selected categories. These are going to be all transactions for a specific type, like all income transactions and so on. But in here, down below under categories, we're going to see if the title is equal to income, like this, then we're going to say these are income categories, else these are expense categories. Once we actually finish through all of these, we're going to console log all of these values so we can see what are we working with. So I'm going to console log selected categories, the total, and finally, we're going to console log the categories. Something that is really useful when console logging a few things is to put everything inside of an object. That way, console log is going to let you know, okay, selected categories, and then it's going to give you the value for that. Total, going to give you value for that, and then category is going to give you value for that. That way, you immediately know what is what. Now we have to loop through our selected categories, and these are transactions, so let's actually rename that because I can see it could cause some problems. We're going to rename it to transactions per type. So these are only going to be transactions of one specific type, either income or expense, okay? So now we can say transactions per type dot for each. For each transaction, we can shorten it for T. So for each transaction, we're going to get the category. So const category is equal to categories dot find. Find accepts a callback function. And then in there, we get one specific category. So which category do we want to find? Well, we want to find the category where c.type is actually equal to t.category. So this could be really confusing, but let's try to explain that. All of our transactions that we have could be something like this. We're going to have a transaction, and it's going to have like an ID. It's going to have a type, for example, income. Also, it's going to have the amount, like let's do 50, and it's going to have a category. Category, for example, being salary. Now, let's say that we have a few of these. Two are going to be income or expense. This is going to be 100, and let's put something like pets here. Let's add one more for income, which is not going to be salary. So the last one is going to be something like business. And we have to add commas. Okay, let's keep this as a comment right here. So these transactions per type, we're filtering out only the ones that we need. So if the title is income, we're going to keep only income. That means that we're going to completely remove this one, at least for now. Now we're left with all the transactions that are of type income, and that is this. That's the array. Then we get a total. The total is going to be equal to the sum of all the current value, that amount, and that's going to be equal to 50 plus 50 plus 50, and that's going to be equal to this total number of 150. Finally, we have all the categories, and categories are going to be income categories or expense categories. In this case, let's say our title is income, so that means that we're going to be left with income categories. And if you remember that constants file, our categories look like this. So let's even copy that so we can have it right there and compare it. Just below, we're going to have these, and I'm going to leave just 3 for now. Okay, so now we know that transactions per type are these, and then categories are actually the full categories with the amount set to 0 inside of them. So what are we doing here? We're mapping through transactions per type, which are these. For each transaction, we need to find a category it belongs to. So in here, we have salary, salary business. So we need to find the salary. I'm going to add one right here. And we need to find business. How do we do that? Well, if transaction.category is equal to category.type, then that's the one. So what do we do with category? We have to increment the amount. How do we do that? We're going to say if the category exists, so simply if category, that's going to be category.amount plus equal to transaction.amount. So what are we doing here is we're saying, okay, let's loop through all the transactions per type. Looping through this income right here. Type is of income, that's okay. Category is of salary. So in the categories, we find this salary and we increment this by 50. Okay, this one is done. We go on to the next one. Amount is 50, category is salary. We go here, increment this by 50. Remove that, and let's go to the third one. Category is business, amount is 50. So we go to business and increment this by 50. With that, we are left with all of the final values or final amounts for each specific category. I hope that this part here now makes just a bit more sense. I know it's complicated. If you cannot follow along, make sure to copy the whole use transactions file. I'm also going to leave it down in the description. Okay, that's great. Finally, we're going to have one final thing, and that thing is going to be this. We have a lot of categories, and we need to remove the ones where we have the amount less than 0 or equal to 0. So we're simply going to do that. Remove them. We need to filter them out. So we're going to say const filtered categories is going to be equal to categories.filter. For each iteration, we're going to get a category. And then for category, we have to say only return the ones where the category.amount is greater than 0. These are only ones that we need. Other ones, you simply drop them, you remove them from this array. And finally, we are left with filtered categories. Well, why do we need those? Because that's what our chart is going to need. Remember, we're working on bringing this data right here. So let's create that. Let's create finally that const chart data. And that's going to be equal to an object. And now we have to follow along the chart.js rules. It says that we need to have a property called datasets. Datasets is going to be an array, and then in there we have one object. Inside of that object, we're going to have a data property, and we're also going to have a background color property. So we can say background color. Okay, so what is going to be the data and what is going to be the background color? Well, the data is going to be filtered categories dot map. And what do we want to do? We simply want to get each category, and for each category, we want to return just the amount, c.amount. And then we're going to copy this part, and for the background color, we want to do a really similar thing, but instead of the amount, we want to return c.color. Remember, this is the final output. We have the amount, that's what we want to return, and this is going to be the color. Great. So now we have the chart data and we need one more thing, and that is going to be labels. Labels is going to be equal to filtered categories dot map. It's the same thing again, category, and this time we return c.type. So along with the amount and the color, of course, we have to specify which category that is. Great, so this is our chart data. So now finally, how do custom hooks work? Well, we have all of this data here, and what we need to do is we need to return it. Return, we're going to return an object, and then inside of that object, we could return filtered categories. We can also return the total, and we can return the chart data. Okay, once that is it, we need to export default our use transactions. So just right here, we can say export default use transactions. Okay, I think that is going to be it for custom hook. Now we can go back to our details. And how do we use a custom hook? Well, we of course import it just as a normal function. Import use transactions from, and that's going to be // use transactions right here. Once we have it, we call it just as a normal function. Would you look at this beauty? We can specify what do we want. And basically we want just the total, which we already calculated, and we want the chart data. Where do we get that from? Well, now you know how to use hooks. We get that from use transaction. And don't forget, use transactions takes in one parameter, which is the title. Right now, I'm noticing that we only need two things, so we can even go back and right at the bottom, we can export only those two things. We don't even need filtered categories. Now we have to use the total and the chart data. So first of all, total is going to be right next to this $, total. And then finally, we can uncomment this, and instead of this string of data, we can specify chart data. That is it. Take a look at how simple this component looks like to read. We have the title. Is it going to be income or is it going to be expense? We specify the corresponding card. We have the header, and we have the content with the chart. Where is all the logic for calculating that? Well, it's right inside of here, inside of the use transactions. We extracted that logic, and now we can use it elsewhere if we want as well. Finally, let's take a look and see if all of this even works. I refresh the page. I'm gonna add a category of business. It's gonna be $100, and let's add it on the current date. Would you look at that? Immediately, business was added. Let's add a salary, for example. Let's do 150, and let's set it to tomorrow. There we go. How nice that looks like. So these are being added right here. Total is also populated automatically. And if we add an expense category, like for example, car, let's say we paid for the gas $50 and click that, take a look at that. This is great, isn't it? Let's add one final one to see what do we get in the console. So let's add one income one, and let's add $50 right there. Okay, there we go. So you can see right there, transactions per type, these are the actual transactions. So we have $50, and that's gonna be in extra income. We have 150 in salary, and we have 100 in the category business. These are transactions for the income types. The total is 300, you can see that right there, and all the categories are right here, but some of them have the amount of 0. Finally, the second console log is for expenses. We have it right there, $50. We have only one transaction, and it has $50 right there. This is amazing. I really like how as soon as we add this, this chart is populated automatically. Now is the right time to make it even better by adding Speechly. Speechly is going to show us how fast and natural it is to use voice to input some data. And that way, as soon as you say something, it's immediately going to be added to a specific chart. To start integrating Speechly, you can head to api.speechly.com/dashboard. I'm going to put the link down in the description. Once you go there, you'll be greeted with this page. Welcome to Speechly, and finally, you can authenticate with either GitHub or Google. In my case, I'm gonna go with GitHub. Okay, once you're authenticated, you'll have access to all of your Speechly applications. So you can create a new app just at the bottom right corner by clicking on Create App button. In here, you can enter your application name. Let's do something like expense tracker. I'm gonna name it YouTube because I already have one. We're gonna set the language to English, and we're going to set the initial configuration to be empty. With that, you can click create. This is going to open up your configuration screen. Inside of here, you can add a few lines of examples of what you would like Speechly to recognize, and then you need to deploy your model. After you deploy your model, the try button turns active and you can try a configuration. That's right here on the bottom right corner. Finally, we can deploy it and then we'll be able to use it inside of our React application. So how does this work? Well, Speechly has its own really easy to understand and extremely intuitive syntax. Let's add a few things. We're gonna add a category underscore income, and that's going to be equal to basically like an array. And then inside of here, you could add a few things that Speechly could recognize as the income categories. So let's say business. Of course, you can keep adding things onto this, but for now, we added the category income. We could also add all the different categories, like for example, salary, and then you can copy that, and we can finally create category expense. In there, we can add something like bills, and we can add car. These are like variables, but now we can create the verbs of our program. These are going to be the functions. So for example, if we want to add an income, we can put an asterisk there and say add underscore income. This is going to activate once we say something like add income for $50 in category. In here, you can use any of the categories we defined before. So how can we do that? Well, you simply need to put a $, category, income, and then you say this is going to be our category. Last thing that we have to do is going to be our date. So we can say for, and then in here we can choose our date. Speechly is handling dates extremely well. So they have a built-in variable called Speechly, all uppercase, dot date. And then in there, you specify the date. So now, once we say this sentence right here, Speechly will be able to recognize it, and we can do something in our app based on that. Of course, this is not really dynamic, but Speechly provides us with a lot of different ways to make this dynamic. It's impossible for every user to every time say the same thing, so we need to make it dynamic. How do we do that? Well, for example, someone can say add income for $50, but someone could also say just income for $50, right? This add is optional, so you can simply wrap it in curly braces. This makes it optional. Then income can stay the same, but this amount here is going to be different. So what we can do is say Speechly dot number, and then in there we accept the amount. So this is going to be given to our React application as the amount. Dollars can also be optional. We don't have to say dollars. Category, that also can be optional. So we can say add $50, and then we don't have to say in, we don't have to say category. We can just continue by saying something like business. Finally, the for as well can be optional. Now, in this case, somebody could say add income for $50 or add income of $50. So how do we handle that? Well, first you wrap this in curly braces, but then you wrap this for in an array structure. And then you say or of. Close the array, and that leaves us with add income for $50 or income of $50. That is great. Of course, you could play with this more to make it more robust, to handle a lot more use cases. For now, this is going to be okay. What we have to do now is add our intents on the right side. This here is considered an intent. So what you can do is simply specify the name, add underscore income. That's going to be our only intent right now. And then entity names, these are going to be different things. In our case, we have category income. Category income is going to be a string, so category underscore income, and then we also have category underscore expense. And what we can do is we can also add these. So this amount right here, that's also going to be an entity name. So we can say amount, and the amount is going to be of a type number. Finally, this date right here is going to be of a type date. So we can say date, and we also have a category right here, category that is going to be a string. Okay, so we now added all of our entities and all of our intents. We added just a simple training example, and let's see how does it work. Now we have to deploy this. So you can click deploy. It's gonna take a few seconds, as you can see there on the bottom right. Right now it is queued. Once this is deployed, we can head to the right bottom side and click try button here. That's going to lead us to the Speechly playground where we'll be able to test our model. Okay, our model is deployed. We can go ahead and click try right here. As you can see, that opened this playground and we can click start. It's gonna ask us to use our microphone. And now we have to press and hold space to talk. Add income for $50 in category business for next Monday. And would you look at that? This is great. Speechly recognized the whole sentence, but it highlighted only the important things. You can see that it highlighted 50, immediately figured out it's an amount, and then put that as a number 50. Then we have the business. Business is a category, and you can see that is highlighted right here. Finally, we have next Monday, and this is really crazy. We simply said next Monday. Speechly immediately found the right date. I cleared the console. Let's try one more time. Add income for $100 in category salary for next Tuesday. Again, works flawlessly. Really good. I'm really impressed. Now, what do you say? Let's make this a bit more robust. Let's add a lot of different sentences and let's add all of our categories. Of course, I don't want you to simply retype all the categories that we have. So once again, in the description, I'm going to give you access to the complete and full configuration. As you can see, to start off, we have all these categories right here. That's the same thing that we have in our application. But then down below, we have a few more things. We have one intent for creating a transaction and one for canceling the transaction. You can see in here, we are using a nice wording of create, finish, and save transaction. We can say either one of these things, and then transaction is optional. Same thing for cancel, delete, and remove. Because a person can say any of these things, right? We have to account for that. But later on, as more people use our application, Speechly's machine learning model is actually going to practice on that, and even if they say something that's not inherently here, it's going to recognize it. Next, I would like to point your attention to these here. This is going to be add expense. Add expense of, for example, $50 in category travel. In here, this is going to be just $50 expense in category travel. Again, it's just a different position of the words. So we have this for adding an expense, we have this for adding income, and these are if you want to add each thing individually. So if you want to set or change the category to something, or for example, if you mess up and I say, I mean category is, that also works. Then again, if you add a date or change the date, that works. Or if you want to set or change the amount, you have all of that here. As you can see, we have these little warnings right there, and we need to create intents. So simply copy and paste all the intents that we have here. We already have the add income, so let's start from the bottom. Then we have the add expense. We have the add amount. We have add date, so we can do that right here. Add category as well, right here. And finally, cancel and create transaction. Easy as that. We just copy and pasted all of these intents. Finally, what you will have to do is click the deploy button. After you click deployed, it's going to take a minute, and then we'll be able to use all of this good stuff inside of our React application. Okay, our Speechly application is deployed. Now we can go back to our React application. Inside of here, we can just collapse all of these windows, close them, and collapse the folders, and we'll be playing with the index.js file. Inside of here, we're gonna wrap our entire thing with Speechly. So as context has its own provider, Speechly also has its own. So first of all, we're gonna import that. Import, and that is going to be speech provider from add Speechly /react-client. Okay, and now you can wrap this entire thing, including the context provider, with our Speechly provider, just like this. Okay, expand that and simply put this right above. Okay, that's it. Speechly provider accepts a few things. First one is going to be the app ID. That's going to be a string. And the second one is a language. Language is going to be EN and then dash capital letters US. So where can you find your app ID? Well, if you go back to your Speechly configuration right here, app ID, you can see it, you can copy it, and let's do that right now. Go back inside of our application and simply copy and paste your app ID right here. Then we need to remove this comma here and simply paste it right here. This is going to be it for our Speechly configuration. Now we have to make use of our Speechly button, which is going to be placed right at the bottom of our main container right here. So we can go back into our app.js, and that's going to be where we're going to put that button. So how can we even get the button? Well, that's going to be import push to talk button and also push to talk button container. We're importing that from @speechly and then / react UI. Okay, so these are UI React components for Speechly button. Now, just below our grid, so the entire grid container, just below there, we're gonna put push to talk button container, and just inside of there, we're gonna put push to talk button without the container on the inside, and this one is going to be a self-closing tag. With that ready, if we go back to our application, let's see if the button appears. And would you look at that? It is there. To activate it, you can simply click on it. And there we go. Now, as you click and hold, it's going to start listening to your voice, and now we can add a transcript so we can see what is he picking up. Before we do that, we're gonna import one more thing from Speechly. And that thing is going to be called error panel. So right in here, we can import error panel, and we can also use it as a component just inside of here, push to talk button container. So you can call it error panel, and it is a self-closing component. Now what you can do is if you go back to your application, and if you start saying something, and if there are some kinds of error with input or with voice, they're gonna be accessible. Right now, we cannot see anything because it's correctly picking up the voice. Next thing that we could do is add a transcript right here so we can see what we are saying. To do that, we can go to our components, main, form, and right here inside of the form where we have these three dots, we have to have our transcript of what we are saying. We can do that if we scroll to the top and import one thing from Speechly. That thing is going to be called use speech context. So right here, we can say import use speech context. Okay. And that's going to be imported from @speechly, and then that's going to be React client. Right now, you can already see this is some kind of a hook. So just below, we can use it as a hook. So just call it like this, and we're gonna destructure one thing from that hook, and that thing is going to be called a segment of voice. That is going to be equal to use speech context, and you simply call it like so. Now that we have this segment, we can use it right in here where we have those three dots. Instead of these three dots, we can open a new logical block in JSX, and we can say if segment exists, then we're gonna do this. We're simply going to have a React fragment, so just like so, and then inside of there, new logical block. What we can say is we're going to map through that segment, more specifically segment.words.map. Inside of here, we get each new word, and that's going to request a callback function where we can say word.value. So we're taking a value out of each word, and finally, we can join them with spaces. So we're going to call join, and then pass in the space in between. Now, if we save that, let's take a look how that's going to look like. Of course, just after our question mark, we also have to add the null. So if this is not right, then show nothing if we don't have a segment. Now, if we save that and go back, let's try saying something. Hello, Speechly, are you picking up this voice? And looks like it is. Okay, awesome. Add income for $50 in category testing right now. Okay, this looks pretty good. It's picking up everything that I'm saying. Now we need to actually hook it up onto our inputs and the date picker. There is one improvement to this. Whenever in React you have something that looks like this, if this is true, then render some JSX, else return null. This can be improved. What you can say, if there is a segment, and then simply say end. And if there is a segment, show this, and then you don't have to have this null. So now this is a lot simpler. We're simply saying if there's a segment, show this. And I even think we don't need this fragment, so we can even just leave it like this and simplify it quite a lot. Okay, so if there is a segment, just map through the words and show all the words right there. Let's save it and see if that works. Okay, I'm gonna refresh. Fire up Speechly. Hello, we're testing. Add income for $50 in category testing. Okay, it's picking up everything that I say. That's great. Now, let's implement the logic for adding the transactions using our voice. Just at the top, we're going to import a simple use effect. Use effect is used if you want to call a specific function at certain points in this component. So for example, at the start of the component or on some changes. So just below create transaction, you can create our use effect. Use effect looks like this. You simply say use effect, and then in there, you call it as a function and pass it two different parameters. First parameter is going to be a callback function, and the second one is the dependency array. For example, if you now put a console log in here in this use effect, this console log hello is going to show up only as soon as the component starts. So we can even save that and test it out. Okay, if we save that and go back to our browser, you can see only one time here is our hello, and if we change some things, it's not gonna re-console log. So what if you want to console log hello every time that you made a change to the form data? Well, in that case, you would simply put the form data inside of this dependency array. That way, this is going to run every time the form data changes. Let's test it out. Refresh the page, we should see one at the start, and now every time that we change something, there we go. We get a new hello just like that. Great. So that is how the use effect works. Now, what are we going to look for changes in? And that is going to be this segment we're taking from Speechly. So in the dependency array, put the segment right here. In our use effect, we're first gonna check if the segment exists. And only if the segment exists, then we can do all of the other logic. Inside of this if, we're gonna have one more if statement, and we're gonna go for segment.intent.intent. So in here, this is gonna be reading our intents. If our intent is equal to add underscore expense, remember we added that into the Speechly configuration. If it is equal to that, then we can set the form data. So we're gonna say set form data, put an object in there, spread the current form data attributes, and finally set the type to expense. So the only thing we're doing here is we're spreading all of the properties from the current form data, but we're changing the type to expense. This is the only thing this line is doing. We should even be able to test it out. Let's go back, add expense. There we go. As you can see, the type changed to expense. Now we're going to do the same thing for the income. So in here, we're going to say else if segment.intent.intent. If that is equal to add underscore income, in that case, what we can do is say set form data. Again, that is going to be an object where we spread the form data. We don't want to lose some things. And then say type is equal to income. Great. So now we have our income as well. Now we're going to add a few more if-else statements. So let's add an else if. In here, we're going to check if segment.isFinal. So we have that segment is final. That is only happening if we are finished talking. So if the segment is final and segment.intent.intent is equal to create underscore transaction, and this is going to be in a string. So create underscore transaction. Only if this is the case, then we're going to return create transaction. So we're going to call that function that we have right here. We're going to create our transaction. Also, we can have a cancel transaction. So we're going to say else if segment.isFinal and segment.intent is equal to cancel underscore transaction. In that case, how do we cancel it? Well, we simply return set form data to be equal to initial state. This initial state is going to reset everything to this initial state. Great, so now we have these main things which are verbs like add, create, and cancel. Now we need to be able to pick up all of these things like categories, amounts, and the date. Let me show you how you can do that. Just inside of this if statement right there, we're going to create segment.entities.forEach. So in here, we're looping over all the entities. I'm going to explain what entities are in just a second. So let's simply say E here as an entity. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to console.log entity.value. We can save that and go back to the browser. Now in here, let's try saying something. Add income for $50 in category salary for next Tuesday. Okay, and as you can see, we got it here. Salary is going to be the category, 50 is going to be the value, and finally we got our date. So these are our entities. If you remember, if we go back to the Speechly configuration, right here, we set our entity names. So we have the amount, date, category, and category income and category expense. With that said, what do we need to do with those values? Well, we can create a switch statement. So inside of here, I'm going to create a switch. And then based on the type of a specific entity, so that's going to be e.type, that can be either category or amount or date. Based on the type, we're going to change some value. So if the type is equal to amount, what can we do? We can say set form data, pass in an object, destructure the form data, as we always do, and set the amount to be equal to e.value. That is it. This is going to make sure to change our amount while still keeping all of the other properties. We still need this break here. Then we're going to add a second case. So let's say case is equal to category. If that is the case, no pun intended, then we can simply set form data, form data, and then we have category is equal to, that's going to be e.value. Great. For the date, I can copy this case right there and paste it. So right in here, this is going to be the case for the date. And the only thing we're changing is in here, we have our date. Okay, looks like we're missing a break statement. So I'm going to add a break right there and also a break right there. Now let's save this and see if it actually works. If we go back to our application, refresh the page, let's take a look what's happening. Add income for $100 in category salary for next Monday. Okay, so everything worked perfectly, but only the category. It didn't pick up the category. So for the salary, it took everything in all caps. We have to have the categories like this, only the first letter uppercase. So let's change that. In our application, just here below the for each, I'm going to say const category, and that is going to be equal to a template string. In here, we're going to have e.value.character at and 0. So remember, this is going to be the first uppercase character, and then we want to take the rest of the string. That is going to be just right here, s.value.slice from 1 all the way to the end of the string. So this is going to be all the other characters instead of the first one. And what do we want to do with those characters? Well, we simply want to say dot to lowercase, because only the first letter needs to be uppercased, all the other ones need to be lowercased. Now we can use that category right here, category. Remember, if you have the same key and the value name, you can simply keep the first one. Okay, let's see if that's going to work now. Looks like I have a small typo. That's going to be character at, care at, and not chart at. So if we save that, let's take a look how it looks like. Add expense for $50 in category travel for next Tuesday. And there we go. That works perfectly. There's only one small thing I would like to do, and that is, what if the user says something like add income for $50 in category travel? That's gonna be a problem, because if he says income, then the category travel doesn't exist, and then we get a warning. That's not ideal. So let's handle that case as well. So in here, in the category, what we can do is we can say if income categories dot map. In here we have the IC, that's going to be the income category. We're gonna map over income categories, so income categories dot type, and then we need to see if it includes the current category we're looking for. So if income categories includes the current category, that's going to be all in the if statement right here. Then we want to set the form data and set the category, but with one thing. Now we know that our income categories includes the current category. So what we can do is we can say right there, type is going to be income, like this. Okay, and then I'm gonna add one more else if statement right here. So that's going to be else if, and we can copy this entire line and simply say else if expense categories. So expense categories, that map includes category. In that case, you guessed it, we're gonna do the same thing. So again, I'm gonna copy this and set form data, set type to expense this time, and then set the category. So now if we go back, and if we say something that doesn't make sense, our application is still gonna work. Add income for $100 in category travel for next Tuesday. So you can see it immediately transferred our type to expense if the category belonged to the expense categories. That's great. Finally, this wouldn't be a great application if now we had to click create. Let's make that create happen automatically if all of our fields are filled. That way, as soon as we finish saying something, it's immediately going to pop up on the chart. To do that, still in this first if where we have the segment, so just inside of there but below everything else, we can say if segment dot is final, so if we're done saying something, and form data dot amount, and form data dot category, and form data dot type. So we're checking if all of the things already exist, and we need to check for the date as well. So we're gonna say and form data dot date. If all of these things exist, what do we want to do? We want to call create transaction. That line is going to make sure to go all the way here and call our create transaction. Let's save it and see if it works. Okay, you can see it already picked up our last transaction, but let's try one more time from the scratch. So right in here, let's add a few transactions. Add income for $100 in category salary for next Monday. Add income for $50 in category business for next Tuesday. Add expense for $50 in category pets for next Friday. Add expense for $150 in category travel for next Friday. As you can see, that works beautifully. All of the transactions are added right here. We should be able to delete them, and that's right, we can. They're showing nicely here on the chart, and we can even toggle the specific thing, so we can see how much money we're spending on or gaining from something. As you saw, this works perfectly, but I would just like to add some more error handling. So in here, we're gonna see if number.isNaN, so if our number is nan, and which number? Well, the number that we get from the form data dot amount. So we have to see if that is nan, or we also need to check for something else, or if no form data dot date dot includes. So our date needs to include the dashes. So in here, I'm gonna put a dash. In that case, we're simply going to return. We're going to go outside of this create transaction and we're not going to create it. So if either one of these is true, we're not going to create our transaction. With that done, our application should work always. Add income for $150 in category travel for next Tuesday. There we go, it works. Now, the thing with the current approach is that it's not gonna save it in the browser storage. Like, as soon as you refresh, the transaction is going to be gone. And this doesn't make a lot of sense for the budget tracking application. It needs to track something over long periods of time. So right now, we're going to implement local storage. You might think that adding our transactions to the local storage is going to be complicated. Oh, it's local storage. How do we do that? We have to interact with the browser, but it's not going to be like that at all. Let me show you. It's going to be extremely simple. The only thing you have to do with the current file structure and context setup is to go to the context reducer. Inside of here, when something happens, like the delete or the add, we have to store the transactions inside of the local storage. So how do we do that? It is as simple as local storage dot set item. You call it as a function, and which item do you want to set? Well, we're gonna call it transactions. Okay, this is just an arbitrary name, and in there you say JSON.stringify, and what are we stringifying? Well, this here are transactions. And you can literally copy this line and paste it below into our add transactions. So once we delete the transaction, we want to take the transactions and store them in the local storage, the new updated ones. Once you add a transaction, we also want to do the same thing. With that said, if we save that, we have to make one more change. That change is going to be into the context. Inside of here, you can see that we are always setting our initial state to be equal to nothing. You can see that the initial state is set to be empty. This is going to happen once the users first open the application. There is going to be no transactions. You can even add something static in here. For example, we can add an object saying, let's do something like amount is equal to 5. We can do category is equal to savings with a capital S. Type is equal to income. And we can add a date. Let's use the current date. So I'm going to say 12-18-2020. And then we can add our ID. In this case, it doesn't really matter. We can just say ID is equal to something like 1. That is it. Now, if we save that, what you'll be able to see that if we refresh the page, we have our savings transaction already here. It is right there. It would be nice to greet users with some predefined transactions, just so they know how it's going to look like once they add a few categories and once these charts fill up. But I'm going to show you a trick. We're going to focus on pulling all of our transactions immediately from our local storage. So right in here, we can say JSON.parse. So we're going to parse something, and we're going to parse local storage.getItem. And which item are you getting? Well, transactions. So we'll say either get this, or if that doesn't exist, then simply get the empty array, so start with nothing. This way, if we go back, refresh the page, we should see nothing. Now, if we go to our application tab and into our local storage, I'm going to completely clear this, open it so you can see it, and refresh the page. Now take a look. Our local storage is empty. We just cleared it. And let's try opening our Speechly. As you can see, first we get the device ID, and then we get the auth token. All of that is just for Speechly, so it can work properly. But now we're going to start adding our own things into our local storage. Add income for $100 in category salary for next Monday. And there we go. We just filled our transactions with our first transaction, which is going to be an income, and you can see the full object right here. Add income for $50 in category business for next Tuesday. Add expense for $55 in category travel for next Monday. Add expense for $75 in category house for next Tuesday. And there we go. All of these transactions are being added in real time, as you can see here, and we're populating our local storage. What you can do right now is you can click edit value right there and then copy what we have right now. We're going to copy that, go back into our application, and now instead of this empty array, we're going to paste that. So in here, we now pasted this, and that means that if we don't have anything in the local storage, we're not going to greet our users with nothing. they'll be greeted with a few pre-done transactions. Now, if you save that and go back, let me show you something. I'm gonna refresh and all of the transactions are still there. That works beautifully. Let's try to add one without using Speechly this time. So it's gonna be income. Let's do something like extra income, $75, and let's keep the current date. And there we go. Transactions are being added. If I refresh, let's see if the last one stays, and it does. Also, take a look at that nice animation once we first reload the page. That's really nice, and you can also collapse or uncollapse some of the things right there. Now, what I wanted to show you, if you go ahead and clear our transactions, that way we have nothing. Now make sure to refresh the page and take a look at this. Our transactions are still being populated. Add income for $55 in category salary for next Monday. Take a look at that. We don't have one transaction, we already have 5. Again, that's just a personal preference. I want to already greet users with something so that they know how they can delete or already have their transactions right there and how is it going to look like on the charts. If you want the users to start with nothing, you can simply put this thing here as an empty array. But with that said, our local storage works perfectly. Add expense for $500 in category bets for next Tuesday. And there we go. It is added. If we refresh, take a look at that. It's really good. As you can see, this is crazy. Adding local storage took us about a few minutes and now everything persists in the browser. Even if you close the browser, that's still going to stay there. To delete this, user has to manually go to the browser's options and delete the memory, and that way it's gonna reset what he has in the local storage. Also, right now I've noticed that our total balance definitely is not working. As you can see, our income is $205 and our expense is $630. That means that we should be in debt, but we are still plus $100. So let's change that. Let's make it work. So how can we calculate the total balance? Well, let's go to our context. Inside of here, we have access to absolutely all of our transactions. Based on these transactions, we should be able to create a new variable called balance. And now the question is, how can we calculate this balance? Once again, we're going to use the reduce method. We're going to say transactions.reduce. So to reiterate, we used reduce before. Remember what we said? Whenever you have multiple values like this array of transactions and you want to sum it down to one single value like a total or a balance, then we use a reduce. Reduce is going to accept a callback function, just like this. That callback function has two different parameters, accumulator and the current value. And it's also going to accept a second parameter right after this function, and that's going to be 0. That's going to be the starting value. So we can expand this function. Our reduce needs to return something, so we're going to say return, and in there we're going to have a ternary. So I'm going to say if current value dot type is equal to expense. So if our current value dot type is equal to expense, then what we want to do is take the accumulator and decrement the current value dot amount. So we're taking the accumulator, which is at the start 0, and we're decrementing the amount of the current value. Why? Because we know that the current value is an expense. Else, what we're going to do is take the accumulator and increment the current value. Of course, we have to say dot amount. And that is going to be it. We can even put this in one line as an instant return because we're working with arrow functions. So just right here, you can also remove this and then we're left with our balance. I know this is just a bit tougher. Reduces are harder to work with. And generally JavaScript in this whole project was a bit tough, especially if we take a look at this. In here, we worked with some pretty heavy JavaScript and also right now with this reduce. If JavaScript is a bit of a problem to you and you want to tackle some of the things in detail like reduce, all the other array and string methods, I created a comprehensive detailed course. It's going to be linked in the description, so definitely if you liked my way of teaching, make sure to check it out. With that said, we have our balance right there, and I'm going to simply pass it next to our transactions. That means that we'll be able to access this balance from anywhere in our file. Now we can go back to our main right here and let's make use of that context. To make use of the context, what we have to do is first import that context. So just at the top, I'm going to say import expense tracker context from, and that's going to be dot dot slash context and then / context. We also have to import use context. So in here, I'm going to say use context. It should be spelled like use lowercase, C uppercase. And now we have everything that we need. We can just destructure the balance. So we say const, curly braces, balance. And where are we destructuring that from? Well, from use context, and more specifically, the expense tracker context. That's going to give us access to the balance variable. Now we can just exchange this variable right in here with some curly braces. That's going to be dynamic. If we save that and go back, let's take a look. How does it look like? Refresh the page and we are in minus 425. Let's remove this expense and we are at $75, 205 minus 130. That seems to be correct. Great. We are slowly coming to the end of this great application. As you can see, everything is starting to look great. Now let's compare it to the finished one and let's see what we are missing. Okay, so first of all, looks basically identical. One thing that I can see is that this in here is centered and this here is not. And why this is centered is that I made this a special component that is going to show up either add expense or add income at random. So sometimes it's going to be add income just so it lets the user know that they can do different things. And we're going to implement that right now. One other thing that is not initially visible is the confirmation message once you actually add the transaction. So let's see that in action. Add expense for $100 in category salary for next Tuesday. And there we go. If you look at the top right corner, transaction successfully created, and you can close that. Let's implement that. If we collapse everything just so we have a clean working environment, that is going to be under the src and under components. We can create a new component. So right there under components, we can create a folder called snack bar. That's how it's called, official name from Material UI. Inside of there, we can create a snackbar.jsx file. In that snack bar, we're going to import React from React. We are also going to import snackbar from, and that's going to be at Material UI core / snackbar. Finally, we need one more thing, and that thing is going to be called MUI alert, just like this, from at Material UI. This time it is going to be / lab. This is an experimental feature, and we need a / alert. So this is the alert we're getting. While we're here, we can also import the styles. So we can say import use styles from /styles. And we can also create that file. So right in the snack bar, we can create styles.js. I'm going to give you all the logic for that. So simply copy and paste it right there. And with that, we can create our functional component. So to create it, I'm going to call RAFCE, and that is going to give us our snack bar. Considering we have the snack bar above, we have to name this differently. I'm going to say customized snack bar, just like that. And then, as we already know, at the top, we can say const classes is equal to use styles, and then we call it. Great. So now how is this snack bar going to look like? Well, it's going to have a class name. Rather, this div is going to have a class name of classes.root. And then inside of there, we are going to have a snack bar. That snack bar is not going to be a self-closing component. Rather, it's going to have quite a few props. So let's add them one by one. First, we have something known as anchor origin. So anchor origin. That is going to be an object, and in there you specify vertical and horizontal axis. So on vertical, we want our snack bar to appear at the top, and on horizontal, we want it to appear on the right. So this is going to be top right position. Of course, you can change this to bottom, left, right, and so on. Then we have a property open. When is this open? For now, we're going to just say true. It's always going to be open. Later on, we're going to have a specific value right there. Then we have the auto hide duration, and you can leave that to anything. I'm going to leave it to something like 3000 milliseconds. That's 3 seconds. And finally, we need a function on close. In here, we're going to call the handle close function. Inside of our snack bar, you can create a component called material UI alert. That is going to be a self-closing component, and it's also going to accept quite a few things. First thing is going to be the on close. So in here, we can say on close, and on close is going to call the same thing, handle close. Then we have the severity, and that is going to be equal to success. So that can be either error, warning, success. In this case, it's simply going to be a string of success. That means that it's going to be a green one. Then we have the elevation of 6. This is simply going to add some styling. And then we have a variant. In this case, variant is going to be filled. I just noticed this is not going to be a self-closing tag. We need to have some text in between. So I'm going to actually write some text right here. And what we can say is transaction successfully created. And that is going to be it. So right now, what we need to do is we have to define this handle close function. And also inside of the open, we'll have a variable called open. Let's first create the handle close. Const handle close, that is going to be an arrow function. It's going to accept 2 different parameters. First one is going to be the event, and the second one is going to be the reason. Now, what they do is they say if reason is equal to click away, just like that, then we simply return. That means that we're not gonna close that. If we just click away, that's okay. It stays there until the time expires, like 3 seconds. But otherwise, if we do want to close it, we'll accept 2 different properties right here, 2 different props. We can destructure them. First one is going to be open, and the second one is going to be set open. So what we can say if we want to close it, that is going to be set open to be equal to false. So the last thing that we have to do is import this component somewhere, for example, in the main, and then call it, and then manage the open and the set open state. The appropriate place to put the snack bar would be in the form. So I'm going to go to main and then form. Right in here, down below. So right below this grid, we can say customized snack bar, and that's going to immediately import it from you. It's going to be a self-closing tag, which is going to have 2 different props. First one is open, and the second one is set open. Okay, as you can see, this looks like a state, and it is going to be a state. For now, we don't have it. So if we scroll to the top, we need to define that open and then set open state. That is going to be as simple as saying const open set open, and that's going to be equal to use state. By default, this is going to be false. We are importing use state, so that's great. And now where are we actually changing that? Well, when we create a transaction, that's going to be right here. We want to say the set open to true, right? Once we create it, we want to show that thing. And if you think about it, that's it. Once we actually create a transaction, show that snack bar, otherwise don't show it, and that's it. It automatically expires after 3 seconds, and that's going to be it. Let's head to our browser and see if it works. I'm going to refresh the page. Well, not this one. We want to work on localhost 3000. And now let's try it out. Add expense for $100 in category business for next Monday. And there we go. Transaction successfully created. And I purposely set business for the expense just to see if it's going to immediately set it as an income, as it should. So that means that it works. Let's test it one more time to see if it shows up again. Add expense for $50 in category travel for next Monday. And there we go. Transaction successfully created. And this nice little animation pushed the transaction right here, so we can also see it right there. That's great. Now to the last piece of the puzzle before we start tackling mobile view, and that is to modify this component. So we're going to go right inside of our form, I think that is, or inside of the main. Yep, that's going to be inside of the main right here. Try saying, and in here you can see that we have it commented. We want to create this info card. That info card is going to be just a simple component right inside of our components, so we don't even have to create a folder. We're simply going to say info card.jsx. Inside of that info card, we're going to say RAFCE, that's going to be React Arrow Function component. And now we can basically copy the entire text that we have from here. Try saying, I'm going to copy that, and we simply want to use that here in this component. So this div is going to have some inline styles, and those styles are going to be text align, and we're going to set that to center. And also padding, which is going to be equal to 0 and then 10%. Okay, now we have that div, and we're going to say try saying. We're going to add a break tag here, just so we add some space. Then we're say add, and I sometimes want this income to be income and sometimes to be the expense. So I'm just going to do it like this. Add income, we need to make this dynamic. We can also make this dynamic so that users know that they can put any number there. In category also has to be dynamic, and Monday also can be dynamic. So to make this simple, I'm just going to add a new variable at the top of our file right there, const is income. And what I'm going to do is say math.random, so math.random, or rather first I'm going to round it. So math.round, and then inside of there, math.random. What this is going to make sure to do is it's going to give us 0 50% of the times and 1 50% of the times, and that's basically a boolean. So just in here we can use the dynamic block, and we can say if it is income, then show a string of income, else show the string of expense. And we can basically use the same logic to repeat this a few times. For example, this can be $100 for the income, $100, and it can be, for example, $50 for expense. Then category can be something like business. And if category is expense, it can be something like house. And then finally for Monday, in here we can say let's leave it as Monday, but for expense, it can be something like Tuesday. Doesn't really matter. That way, 50% of the times, we're going to see something like income, $100, business, Monday, and other 50% of the times, we'll see this. So now if you save that, the only thing we have to do is import it right here inside of the main. So what I'm going to do is say info card, and that should immediately add it as an import at the top of your file. Let's save it and see how does it look like. Okay, looks like we're missing a few spaces. What we're going to actually do is go back into the info card, and whenever you have this string right there, so I'm going to select multiple things. I'm holding Alt on Windows. You can select multiple things and then simply add a space at the end of each one of these strings. That way, we'll be sure to have a space right there. And if you save that, that should be good. As you can see, we have this nice and centered. And now if we refresh, sometimes it's going to be expense, and other times it is going to be income as we got it now. Great, our application is almost done. Final step is to see how is it going to look like on mobile. So you can open the inspect element and then you can click toggle device toolbar. Okay, this is going to make it appear on mobile. Make sure to refresh one more time. And there we go. We have our income on the top, we have our expense tracker right there, and then we have the expenses. This is not really intuitive for mobile devices. On mobile, you would expect to see the expense tracker first, the main thing. Because here on desktop, you can see everything at once, and it makes sense that you have the main at the center. But since this is first here, on mobile, that's going to appear on the top, and we don't want that. So how can we make this form appear on the top only on mobile? That is going to be our next step. To handle that, we're going to go back in the app because this is where we have the actual setup. And what I'm going to do is just add a few classes. For the first one, I'm going to say classes or class name is equal to classes.mobile. That means that this first one is not going to be visible on mobile. I'm going to show you what did we do in the classes later on. Now in here, this one is going to have a class name of classes.main. This expense right there is going to have a class name of classes.desktop. Now what we have to do is we have to copy this grid, this is our income, and we have to paste it below our main one more time. So if you're on mobile, this one is going to be hidden and this one is going to be showing. So in here, we can say something like classes.desktop. Of course, you can change the names of these classes. And finally, to this last one, I'm going to say class name is equal to classes.last. Now I'm going to open our styles side by side so that you can see what we are doing. As you can see for our desktop class right there, and that is this one, it's simply saying if we're on devices larger than this small, so that's going to be all desktop devices, then don't show it. So you can see this one here, we're not showing. If we're on larger devices than small, then we're showing this one, the one on the left, but the one on the top we're removing. I know it can be a bit confusing, but now if you saved all of this, that should work. We're basically hiding the one at the top and showing it below on the main on mobile devices. If we go back, there we go. Take a look at that. We're showing that, and we also added some margin bottom there so we can have the button right here. It feels really natural, and again, with Material UI, we didn't even have to focus a lot on making this work for mobile. It worked automatically. You can see how we can scroll through our transactions, we can delete them, we can add them, you can view the income and expense charts, and this works beautifully. Now on mobile, this is going to work perfectly, but while you're testing mobile on desktop, if you hold this, a menu is going to appear right here. Take a look, and that sometimes obstructs the view. So while testing, the only thing you have to do to get rid of it is paste this line right there. Window, on context menu, and return false. That way, we won't be seeing that context menu, but again, on mobile, when this is deployed, that's not going to show up. So finally, let's test it out on mobile devices. I'm going to collapse this and let's take a look. Add income for $500 in category business for next Tuesday. And as you can see, that works perfectly. Finally, one more thing that I noticed that we could improve is that, for example, if you're right there at the bottom, you're looking at the bottom of your screen and then you're trying to say something like, add expense of $50 of category travel for next Tuesday. You can see it added it. It worked perfectly, but you weren't able to see what's happening on the screen while you were saying that. So what we want to do to make this perfect is add a scroll once you're on mobile to scroll to the main if you're immediately saying something. To do that, we're going to stay in our app, and the only thing we have to do is we have to import something known as useRef from React. We'll also have to import the use effect. So just before, say use effect. Great. Now that we have that, I'm going to create a new use effect. Use effect, and we already learned it accepts a callback function and it accepts a dependency array. Now we can use a great feature from Speechly, and that is going to be a speech state. So we need to import just two things from Speechly. At the top, you can say import speech state, so speech state, and also use speech context. We're going to import that from @Speechly, and that is going to be React client. Now that we have those, right in here as a hook, you can simply say const destructure the speech state from, so simply equal sign, and then use speech context. So use speech context. Okay, so whenever the speech state changes, then we want to call this use effect. And what we can say is if speech state is equal to speech state dot recording with a capital R, in that case, we want to do something, and that something is execute scroll. So in that case, we want to scroll. That execute scroll is going to be a function we can create right now. So just above our use effect, we can say const execute scroll, and then that's going to be a function which is simply going to say main dot current dot scroll into view, and you call that as a function. Now, what you might be wondering is, what is this main? Well, that main is going to be a reference to our main component. So just at the top, you can say const main is equal to use ref. At the start, it is going to be null, but then down below on our main, or rather on our grid that covers the main, you can simply say ref is equal to main. That is going to be it. Looks like we have a typo. This is going to be execute scroll. I just noticed in here that Visual Studio Code autofilled some mail outline rounded for me here instead of the main. So in here, I'm simply going to say ref is equal to main, and we can remove this import right here. With that said, let's go back to the browser and test it out. Inside of here, if we don't want to see that menu popping up again, you can simply call window on context menu function return false. And with that, let's scroll down and let's try saying something. Add income for $50 in category business for next Monday. And there we go. It immediately scrolled to our main component so that we can see what Speechly is inputting for us while we're speaking. That is great. I just noticed that we are missing some space right there in this divider. You can see that this text here and this text here are too close together. So let's just add some space. To do that, you can go back to your code, and the only thing you have to do is go to your main component, find this divider right there, and give it a class. Class name is going to be equal to classes.divider. If you add that and go back, this now looks great. We can even go back to the browser and see how does the browser version look like, and it is great. With that said, we're done with this amazing application and we are ready to deploy it. That way, you'll be able to use it anywhere on any device, and it's gonna look great on mobile devices as well. For deployment, I prefer Netlify. It is really straightforward. You can just go to netlify.com and then log in or sign up. So we can do that. And then the only thing you have to do is click sites right here. Once you click that, scroll a bit down, and then in here, we need to drag and drop our website. Now, with React applications, you cannot simply drag and drop the entire source or the entire root. What you need to do is stop your server from running. So we're gonna press Ctrl C to stop it. And then you need to type npm run build. This is going to create an optimized production build that you can simply copy and paste or drag and drop right into your Netlify. This is going to take about a minute, so I'll be right back when this is done. Okay, that is now done, and you should be able to see this build folder right here. What you can do is you can press open with File Explorer or open with Finder on Mac and simply open that folder. Once you do that, you'll be able to see it here, and then what you have to do is simply drag and drop it into your Netlify. So once you're on your Netlify, simply drag and drop your build folder right in here. Netlify is extremely fast. This should take about a few seconds, and there we go. Our application is deployed. Before we open it, we're going to do one more step, and that is go to the domain settings. Then in here, click Options, Edit Site Name. Inside of here, you can say something like expense, tracker, React, Speechly. I'm just choosing a long name because I want it to be available. You can put something that you prefer right here. Once we have that, you will be able to reach this site by going to this nice URL. And there we go. Our application is here with our demo transactions. Remember, we wouldn't see anything if we didn't add those static ones. So now I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these, and let's add a few together. You have to give your browser access to use your microphone. And now let's try something like add income for $150 in category business for next Tuesday. Perfect. Add income for $500 in category salary for next Friday. Add expense for $50 in category pets for next Wednesday. Add expense for $555 in category house for next Thursday. And there you have it. This is your application. It uses local storage, context API, custom hooks. It also uses Speechly, which uses machine learning behind the scenes, and you can traverse this application using your voice. It is definitely revolutionary. To finish this video off, I would just like to say a huge thank you for the people from Speechly, not only for sponsoring this video, but also for creating such an amazing software that is easy to integrate and that allows you to use your voice with your React applications. Great job. That is going to be it for this video. Thank you so much. This was a long one to create, so if you like it, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, say what would you like to see in the next one, and have a wonderful day.